We are opening a book today, uh, a truly remarkable philosophical work called Adventures of Ideas by Alfred Whitehead.
And as you listen, we want you to settle into a quiet space in your own mind.
Yeah, exactly. Settle in, because this exploration is the very first part of a continuous 10-part journey through the pages of this text.
Our conversation will flow seamlessly across all 10 parts, tracing a slow, monumental drift.
Right, the drift of mankind towards civilization. We're going to explore how civilized beings actually arise.
And how the adventure of ideas is the essential beating heart required to preserve that very civilization.
To really establish your perspective as you take this journey with us, we have to rethink how we look at history.
It is so tempting to view history merely as a dry record of the past, a dusty catalog of dates and kings.
But here, we are looking at history as a living force.
It is a space where ideas, both the grandly inspiring ones and the profoundly dangerous ones, are actively shaping our present and our future.
We are, in essence, watching the human mind slowly awaken.
And that awakening begins with a rather uncomfortable realization about how we perceive the past in the first place.
Right, there is this fascinating argument presented early on that pure history,
The concept of history completely devoid of aesthetic prejudice or theoretical interpretation.
exactly, that pure history is an absolute figment of our imagination.
The idea that we can just look at the bare facts without the filter of human emotion or bias is, well, it's an illusion.
Historians always, inevitably, judge the past based on the unspoken ideals of their own contemporary era.
Consider how different minds interpret the exact same historical timeline.
Like Hegel.
Yeah, when the philosopher Hegel looked at the sweeping political history of mankind, he concluded that the ultimate culmination of all human experience was the Prussian state of his own time.
He looked backward and saw everything leading perfectly to his own front door.
Yet, just a generation later, the historian Macaulay looked at the exact same sweep of history and confidently decided that the English constitutional system of his day was the true pinnacle of human achievement.
It shows that knowledge is never just mere knowledge.
It is always wrapped in emotion, in purpose, and in the invisible limitations of the historian's own era.
It's like looking through a telescope and suddenly realizing you're just seeing a reflection of your own eye.
That's a great way to put it. And this dynamic is perfectly illustrated by Edward Gibbon's massive, multi-volume work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
On the surface, Gibbon is writing a meticulously detailed account of the Romans over 1,000 years. The legions, the emperors, the clash of emerging religions.
But throughout that entire narrative, it is actually Gibbon speaking. He's breathing the dominant spirit of his own 18th century world into the text.
His work is fundamentally a mirror.
Gibbon's history is a record of the mentality of his own time, exemplifying the general ideas of what we might call the Silver Age of the modern European Renaissance.
And there is a profound, almost tragic historical irony in his work.
Absolutely. Gibbon was completely oblivious to the fact that his own era, this modern Silver Age he felt so secure in, was about to be utterly destroyed.
Destroyed by the explosive impacts of steam and democracy.
He couldn't see the seismic shifts happening under his own feet, even though he was dedicating his life to writing about how the Roman Silver Age was destroyed by the exact counterparts of his time.
The barbarians and the Christians.
Right. That blindness to the forces reshaping our own world brings up a crucial dichotomy of historical change.
We can divide the massive forces that push history forward into two distinct categories.
The first category consists of senseless agencies, or compulsions.
These are the blind, unthinking physical or environmental forces. Think of ancient geological shifts.
Eons ago, massive changes in global rainfall and the resulting growth of immense, towering forests literally forced early mammals to ascend into the trees.
Which pushed their evolution toward becoming apes.
And then, after a vast period of time, the climate shifted again.
The decay of those same forests forced them back down to the ground, where they became men.
Those senseless agencies operate throughout all of human history, not just in our biological evolution.
The blind forces of nature, like the sudden discovery and exploitation of coal, steam, electricity, and oil.
They drive society away from its inherited modes of order.
A technological breakthrough disrupts the social fabric, just as surely as the violent incursions of Attila the Hun drove the degenerate Romans from their established norms.
These forces do not have a conscious intellectual end in mind. They don't care about the social fallout.
They are sheer, undeniable compulsion.
But on the other side of that dichotomy, you have formulated aspirations.
These are the conscious ideals that stand at odds with ancestral customs,
Think of the birth of early Christianity within the rigid structure of the Roman Empire.
or the conceptual dawn of modern democracy.
These are not blind geological forces. They are articulated beliefs.
They are persuasive agencies that actively, deliberately refashion their respective ages.
And society does not move from one age to another cleanly.
When these senseless agencies and formulated aspirations collide with old, dumb habits that are passing away, society enters a zone of anarchy.
This transition period is rarely smooth.
This zone can be a passing danger, a brief moment of cultural vertigo, or it can be a prolonged welter of misery, decay, and societal collapse.
It is only by enduring this chaotic zone of anarchy that a new complex of habits can finally emerge and stabilize.
I'd like you, the listener, to quietly reflect on that for a moment. Look at the landscape of our own society today.
What senseless agencies, perhaps our rapid technological shifts, artificial intelligence, or climate changes,
And what newly formulated aspirations are currently dragging our own world through its own messy zone of anarchy?
navigating such zones requires an understanding of how our earliest formulated aspirations were born.
We have to trace the geographical and intellectual transmission of civilization itself.
This transmission can be tracked from the Near East, stretching from the fertile Nile Valley over to Mesopotamia.
And watched as it slowly moves into Western Europe, spearheaded primarily by the intellectual frameworks of the Hebrews and the Greeks.
As that civilization moved, the human mind's understanding of itself had to evolve.
Early human societies looked out at the terrifying powers of nature and saw bestial, ruthless, placable gods.
The early mind was overwhelmed by the sheer destructive power of storms, droughts, and predators long before it could afford to sit back and appreciate the loveliness of a sunset.
Because if nature is just trying to kill you, you don't admire it, you just try to appease it.
That survival instinct kept early societies trapped in a cycle of fear.
The true progress of religion and philosophy is actually defined by the denunciation of those older, ruthless gods.
In this context, idolatry is not just about worshiping golden statues.
It is defined simply as being content with the prevalent gods and the current brutal state of society.
To be an idolater is to lack the critical perspective needed for progress.
The defining factor that pushes humanity forward out of the mud is a noble discontent.
A noble discontent. Plato and the Hebrews were the ones who truly formalized this program for discontent.
Plato went so far as to banish the traditional poets from his ideal society, because they kept singing the old songs of those customary capricious gods.
Instead, Plato analyzed the human soul, the psyche.
He shifted the focus of human aspiration away from merely surviving the whims of ruthless nature,
And toward a much higher appreciation of beauty, intellectual distinction, and moral duty.
By focusing on the soul, Plato gave humanity a standard of perfection.
It was a conceptual standard that made people look around at their current, brutal reality and feel that necessary, noble discontent.
They could finally imagine something better.
However, the tragedy of human history is that ideas of high generality take a painfully long time to actually reshape the foundational physical structures of society.
Which brings us to the great unspoken presuppositions of an epoch.
Every age has a foundational form of thought that is so translucent, so universally accepted by everyone living in it, that it's like the air we breathe.
People don't even realize they are inhaling it, let alone questioning it.
In the classical Mediterranean civilization, that invisible foundation was the absolute necessity of human slavery.
Consider the most brilliant forward-thinking minds of that ancient consensus. You have Pericles, Plato, Alexander the Great, Cicero.
These figures had vastly different political theories, ethical frameworks, and philosophies.
Yet they all universally assumed that a massive slave population was required to perform the daily services deemed unworthy of a fully civilized man.
Efficiency literally meant brutality.
They genuinely believed that a complex urban civilization simply could not be self-sustaining.
They thought it had to have a barbarous substratum woven into the very bottom of the social structure just to support the civilized apex at the top.
Even the most kindly masters, like Cicero or the gracious host in Plato's Symposium, accepted it as a matter of course.
It was just the way the universe worked.
Contrast this with modern political theory, and you see a complete inversion.
Today, freedom and equality are the unspoken presuppositions of our political thought.
We certainly have our own lame qualifications and hypocrisies in practice today, just as the ancients had theirs.
But the fundamental premise has flipped. We face in the directly opposite direction from the ancients.
If a genius like Plato, or a brilliant Stoic lawyer like Cicero, understood the beauty of the human soul. Why didn't they champion the abolition of slavery?
If they could conceptualize moral perfection, why did they let the brutality continue right in front of them?
They were paralyzed by the terrifying complexity of reform.
To instantly abolish the only economic system the ancient world knew would have caused the heavens to fall.
It would have meant total economic collapse and the destruction of civilization entirely.
The Roman government, with the firmness of its Senate and the strict discipline of its legions, was seen as the one fragile hope for the human race against a descent into total barbarism.
To rip the economic foundation out from under it, even knowing it was a rotten and brutal foundation, would mean the end of all progress.
There is a surviving ancient statue of a Scythian slave sharpening a knife that serves as a profound metaphor for this.
His body is entirely bent over his labor, physically crushed by the weight of his servitude, but his glance is looking upward.
That bent figure, looking up, symbolizes the silent martyrs of history.
The millions of suffering people who bore the crushing weight of human progress on their backs.
So that civilization could survive long enough to eventually, thousands of years later, figure out how to free them.
A great idea doesn't just wait for a few good men to come along and carry it into practice.
The actual material conditions of society have to evolve enough to physically sustain the weight of that new idea.
One of the most vital mechanisms for keeping that pure idea of human dignity alive, while society slowly caught up, was the emergence of interim ethics.
We see this vividly in the emergence of early Christianity within what is termed the Galilean environment.
The early followers of this movement genuinely believed that the end of the world was imminent.
The fiery crash of society was certain, and it was going to happen in their lifetimes.
Because of this apocalyptic belief, they didn't have to worry about the practical realities of maintaining the complex infrastructure of the Roman Empire.
They were isolated, living a simple peasant life, far away from the discipline of the Roman legions or the massive legal complexities of imperial administration.
That fortunate ignorance of statecraft allowed them to create an entirely pure, absolute standard of moral intuitions.
They could formulate concepts completely devoid of ferocity or political compromise.
They could preach a radical doctrine of forgiving an enemy 70 times 7.
Which, in the ruthless world of the Roman Empire, was basically a great way to get yourself killed by Tuesday.
In the real brutal world of the Herods, turning the other cheek 70 times 7 was completely impossible for a state or an individual trying to survive.
But because these ethics were formed in isolation by people who believed the world was ending anyway, these impracticable morals survived in their pure, uncompromised form.
They became a permanent gauge.
A spiritual gadfly that would constantly irritate the conscience of all later societies.
They set a standard of behavior that was foolproof against perversion.
Always hovering above humanity, reminding us of how far our practical realities were falling short of our moral potential.
As the centuries passed, that gadfly kept biting.
And eventually you see the vanguard of freedom begin to form its base alliances to finally change the physical world.
The tide began to turn in the 18th century Age of Reason, fueled by French humanitarianism and brilliant English thinkers like Bacon, Newton, and Locke.
Intellectual arguments from philosophers were not enough on their own to move the masses.
A crucial, unexpected catalyst was required: the Wesleyan and Methodist revival.
For centuries, the great religious movements of Europe were accompanied by deeply rationalistic intellectual justifications.
You had the brilliant, complex theological arguments of Aquinas, Luther, and Calvin.
Arguments meant for scholars and clerics. The Methodists took an entirely different path.
They bypassed constructive reason and appealed directly to the vivid, raw emotions of working men and isolated pioneers.
Picture those massive open-air sermons where thousands of exhausted miners and laborers would gather.
To hear preachers speak directly to their hearts, not their intellects.
Their primary goal was saving souls for the next world.
But incidentally, they gave a massive new direction to human emotions energizing in this world.
By appealing directly to the intuition of the masses, they inadvertently made the abstract concept of the brotherhood of man a vivid, tangible reality.
They provided the final, overwhelming emotional wave that made the continuation of slavery impossible to justify among progressive societies.
This emotional wave did not work in isolation.
It combined with the quiet, persistent heroism of Catholic missionaries who extended their intense self-sacrifice across the Americas.
Keeping the European conscience painfully sensitive to the plight of indigenous populations.
It also united with the explicit, unyielding anti-slavery formulation of the Quakers, particularly the profound and gentle work of John Woolman.
It was a checkered, messy triumph, bringing together skeptical humanitarians, Catholics, Methodists, and Quakers into a unified front against a foundational evil.
But as we look at that triumph, we have to recognize the tragic historical irony that often accompanies the evolution of ideas.
Great intuitions often ally themselves with base, inherited brutalities.
Take the ancient Carthaginians. They were a highly advanced, civilized trading nation.
They successfully navigated and traded from the shores of Syria all the way to the distant tin mines of Cornwall.
Yet, despite all that sophistication, they still conceived of the supreme powers of the universe in such a brutal way that they literally sacrificed their own children to the god Moloch.
Believing this horrific act was a necessary religious propitiation to keep the universe in balance.
It took thousands of years for the Platonic ideal of the human soul to slowly, painfully purify that kind of inherited human conduct.
And yet, just as the humanitarian ideal was reaching its great victory regarding abolition, and just as the technology of the post-17th century was finally eliminating the physical necessity for manual slave labor, an entirely new threat emerged.
In the 19th century, a profound pushback against the humanitarian ideal began to take shape.
Society was shifting heavily toward modern big business,
We started seeing a sort of neo-feudalism.
where instead of lords and serfs tied to the land, you had corporate monopolies and laborers tied to interlocked, specialized jobs they couldn't escape.
But the physical shift wasn't the most dangerous part.
Intellectually, the very foundation of the brotherhood of man was being actively dismantled.
New, ruthless intellectual forces began to dominate the cultural conversation.
You had Thomas Malthus's iron law of population, which argued mathematically that the masses must always press on the limits of bare subsistence.
Normalizing mass starvation as a law of nature.
You had the harsh zoological law of natural selection, depicting a ruthless environment that inevitably crushes out the less favored.
Translating easily into social Darwinism.
But most devastatingly, there was David Hume's philosophical critique of the human soul.
Hume challenged the very Platonic concept that had driven so much moral progress over the millennia.
He argued that the human mind is not a unified divine soul at all.
Hume posited that the mind is merely a flux of impressions.
Every thought, every feeling is just a distinct, self-sufficient existence temporarily passing through.
There is no enduring self.
Consequently, Hume made the chilling assertion that there is no such passion in human minds as the love of mankind, merely as such.
We only love what is immediately useful or pleasant to our specific flux of impressions.
Wait, let me make sure I have this right. Hume is basically saying that if you strip away the romantic, ancient idea of a soul, we are all just biological machines processing random sensory data.
And if we're just isolated machines, then the moral foundation for the brotherhood of man suddenly loses its anchor entirely.
Why should one machine care if it exploits another machine?
If humans are nothing but a random flux of impressions, Hume's challenge strikes at the very heart of the humanitarian ideal.
It forces us to look backward to times when humanity desperately tried to build frameworks to prevent that kind of isolation and exploitation.
We can look at the Middle Ages and their desperate attempt to find coordination in a fractured society.
You see this vividly in Dante's De Monarchia, which expresses a deep universal desire for mankind to simply find peace, unity, and quietness in a chaotic, warring world.
Which leaves you to ponder how that deep, beautiful desire for peace and quietness is constantly, inevitably disrupted by other human impulses.
It is disrupted by those senseless agencies shifting the ground beneath our feet.
And by the formulated aspirations that refuse to let us rest in our complacency.
It is exactly this tension, this constant disruption of our fragile peace by the ongoing messy adventure of ideas,
Which we will explore directly as we turn to the next consecutive part. As we step back into the pages of this book, we really find ourselves at a threshold. We're looking out over this vast, constantly shifting landscape of human thought.
Yeah.
And we are continuing our exploration of how profound philosophical ideas do not merely exist in a vacuum, but how they actively shape the history and the entire trajectory of human civilization.
Exactly.
It is important to remember that you are joining us for the second part of a continuous 10-part journey through this remarkable text. Our mission for this specific segment is to deeply examine the tension between the ideals of pure competition and social harmony. We are going to trace the complex, sometimes painful evolution of the humanitarian ideal and uncover the historical birth of both social and corporate freedom.
That is precisely the path we must walk today. And as you listen, I really invite you to quiet your mind. Allow yourself to absorb the dense historical and philosophical shifts that define the very structures of our modern world. We are, peeling back the layers of assumed knowledge to reveal the foundations of how we organize ourselves, how we view each other, and how we define freedom.
Right.
It is a gentle but necessary dismantling of the past to understand the present.
We begin with a monumental shift in human perspective, the illusion of pure competition. To understand this, we really have to look back to the Middle Ages. That era was deeply haunted by the ghost of the old Roman Empire.
It really was.
It was a society absolutely obsessed with the Roman ideal of coordination, order, and structured harmony. Every person had their ordained place in the grand hierarchy, but as the Renaissance dawned and eventually bled into the 19th century, society became completely obsessed with the individual.
Yeah, the classical authors were read again, of course, but the Roman statesmen's ideals of strict order were decisively ignored in favor of a new, fierce independence.
Exactly.
It was as if society entirely replaced the lens through which it viewed reality. Wherever men looked, they saw the word competition written across the very face of things. The concept of coordination vanished.
It just disappeared.
Right.
When they looked at international relations, they no longer saw a family of nations. They saw nations competing ruthlessly for dominance. When they examined the theory of trade, they construed all its interactions purely in terms of competition, perhaps only slightly softened by the daily act of haggling.
It permeated everything, didn't it? Even the way they looked at the natural world.
It really did. When they observed the bounty of nature and the food supply, they saw the masses of mankind competing for desperately insufficient resources. Even when looking at the sheer variety of nature, the myriad species of living things, they explained it all through the competition of species. Life itself was the prize.
A harsh prize.
If you were an unsuccessful competitor, you simply died out, conveniently ceasing to be a social problem. And upon this incredibly harsh view, the 19th century liberal faith attempted to build a fragile compromise. They held an optimistic, almost paradoxical belief that this relentless, individualistic strife would somehow naturally and inevitably produce a perfectly harmonious society. Which, if we think about it logically, is a bit like throwing 100 hungry people into a room with one sandwich and assuming it will naturally result in a polite dinner party.
Yes.
It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And historically, that fragile compromise faced a tragic and catastrophic failure. The new industrial system, which theoretically should have been the ultimate triumph for these purely economic liberal doctrines, simply did not work for the betterment of humanity.
It was a disaster on a human level. In England, where these doctrines of pure economic liberalism were first wholeheartedly applied without any safety nets, the result was widespread, staggering misery.
Unimaginable misery.
Decades of unmitigated individualism and competition led to a resurgence of something intimately resembling industrial slavery at the very base of society. We are talking about the dark, suffocating coal mines, the incredibly dangerous factories, and the squalid, overcrowded slums.
And this catastrophic failure fundamentally fractured the political landscape of the time. You suddenly had a stark division. On one side, there were what we might call the pure liberals.
Right.
These were the people who stubbornly clung to the atomistic view of society. The idea that society is just a collection of disconnected individuals and the government should never intervene. On the other side, you had the modified liberals.
And ironically, those modified liberals included many of the older traditional Tories. These were conservatives who looked at the absolute squalor of the working class and realized they had to support desperately needed remedial measures like factory acts and labor laws. They realized that pure individualism, with no mitigating practices, was literally destroying the fabric of society.
It was exactly out of this profound failure, this immense human suffering ushered in by the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, that Karl Marx formulated his doctrine of the class war. The book makes a brilliant point here. It doesn't matter whether contemporary economists viewed Marx's specific doctrines as scientifically sound or not.
Exactly. The technical soundness almost didn't matter.
His ideas became an undeniable, earth-shattering power because they were a fierce, inevitable reaction to the undeniable evils of the industrial system.
It is a perfect example of how philosophical ideas are born from material conditions. But just as the economic justification for this liberal compromise was collapsing under the weight of human suffering, an equally profound scientific challenge to the humanitarian ideal emerged.
Right, the intellectual hits just kept coming. We see the rise of the Malthusian doctrine. Thomas Malthus famously argued that overpopulation was a fundamental law of nature. His mathematical argument was that population grows exponentially while the food supply only grows arithmetically.
A grim calculation.
Therefore, he concluded, the masses of mankind could never permanently emerge into a state of high well-being. Poverty was just a natural balancing mechanism.
And if Malthus wasn't bleak enough, Charles Darwin then promulgated the theory of natural selection. This scientific shift was devastating to the traditional moral framework of Western civilization. For 2,000 years, the Stoic Christian ideal of democratic brotherhood had slowly, painstakingly cultivated emotions of respect, charity, and friendliness between man and man.
The core belief was that we are all children of the same universe, bound by a fundamental kinship.
Exactly.
That is a terrifying pivot for a society to undergo. So science essentially told Victorian society that their deeply held values of charity and brotherhood were actually holding back human evolution.
That is precisely how it was interpreted. These new scientific theories, alongside the modern doctrines of heredity emerging from thinkers like Francis Galton and the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel, fundamentally threatened that Stoic Christian ideal. Suddenly, nature was presented not as a harmonious divine creation, but as a ruthless scavenging process.
A scavenging process.
Science seemingly replaced the deeply held belief in the brotherhood of man with a cold biological directive pointing toward the extermination of the unfit. The intellectual security that once justified democratic liberalism and social welfare was entirely stripped away.
In the face of this bleak, almost mechanical view of human existence, there had to be pushback. And we do see intellectual rescue attempts trying to save the concept of human goodness. Jeremy Bentham steps forward with his utilitarian principle, advocating for the greatest happiness of the greatest number.
Yes, Bentham was crucial there.
We also see the French philosopher Auguste Comte establishing his religion of humanity, which is often referred to as positivism.
Both Bentham and Comte performed an immense service to democratic liberalism at a time when it desperately needed a defense. They successfully promoted democratic ideals and very practical, actionable programs of reform. They did this by relying on generalized emotions of benevolence.
Right.
They effectively swept away the mysterious, mystical claims of privileged orders and aristocracies, replacing them with a focus on general human well-being.
But the book points out a crucial flaw in their rescue mission. In their rush to establish a practical working system of social reform, they completely discarded metaphysics. They threw out the deep philosophical foundations. They just accepted these generalized emotions of human brotherhood as ultimate moral intuitions that required no further cosmological justification.
They took a shortcut.
They essentially said, we all agree it is good to be good to each other, so let us just start there and not ask why.
And that is exactly where the foundation crumbles. Because they lacked a solid philosophical underpinning, their doctrines were utterly defenseless against the skepticism of philosophers like David Hume. Hume powerfully argued that there is simply no natural passion for the love of mankind merely as such.
We love our family, we love our friends.
But a generalized love for a stranger just because they are human, Hume argued that does not naturally exist in the human animal.
So without a deeper metaphysical grounding to prove that we should care about each other, the idea of universal benevolence becomes just an unreasonable emotion. And in a post-Darwinian world, it looks like an emotion actively standing in the way of evolutionary progress.
It does.
To solve this profound philosophical riddle, the book guides you into a fascinating breakdown of physical science itself. It argues that our superficial ethical controversies often stem from a total lack of clarity about the very nature of reality.
It is a profound pivot in the text. The author presents 4 distinct categories of physical science to clarify how we measure existence and value. First, there are the true things that endure. Think of a physical object like a piece of rock, or to step beyond pure physics into philosophy, a human soul. These are entities that persist through time.
Okay, so that is category 1, things that endure. What is the second?
Second, there are the true things that occur. This is an event. It could be an explosion in a room, a conversation, or your complex internal experience within a fraction of a second. It is something that happens and then is gone.
Category 3 is where it gets tricky. These are the abstract things that recur.
Yes. A shape, a specific shade of color, or a feeling of happiness. Happiness is not an object you can hold, nor is it a single event that happens once and never again. It is an abstract quality that recurs across different times and different people.
And if we look closely at Bentham's utilitarian principle through this very specific lens, a glaring problem emerges. His whole philosophy is based on calculating the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But how can one possibly calculate the greatest happiness if happiness is merely a recurring abstraction?
It breaks down.
It's like trying to measure the greatest amount of running. Running is an action that recurs, but people are the enduring things doing the running. You cannot just add them up mathematically. We have to ask ourselves, how do we mathematically add up the happiness of 3 short-lived people and compare it against the happiness of 1 long-lived person?
It is a brilliant deconstruction of utilitarianism. The phrase greatest happiness refers to recurrences, but it is applied to the greatest number of people, which refers to enduring things. This unexamined oscillation between things that endure, things that occur, and things that recur creates total intellectual chaos. You cannot build a moral framework on a mathematical equation that fundamentally miscategorizes reality.
Which brings us to the 4th category of physical science, the laws of nature. And this is where the book offers a paradigm shift that is truly revolutionary.
Wait, so instead of the universe having a strict rule book imposed from the outside by some detached creator, the rules are just the habits of the things living inside it.
That is precisely the revelation. Traditionally, we have viewed the laws of nature as rigid external rules imposed upon things. Gravity, thermodynamics, biology. We think of them as a cosmic cage. But here, they are explained instead as communal customs. The laws are the natural outcome of the character of the behaving things themselves.
That completely changes how we view reality. It does. Think of it at a molecular level. The laws governing molecules packed closely together in a dense city are technically the same as anywhere else, but the behavior of those things amid that close pack is vastly different from their behavior amid the electromagnetic fluxes of empty space. The environment participates in the nature of each of its occasions. The laws merely express the general character of the occasions composing that environment.
And this connects so beautifully to the concept of human progress.
Mhm.
If our societal laws are just communal customs, then human progress is not about fighting against an immovable reality. The impracticable ideals we hold, such as the profound, almost impossible ethics of Christianity, turning the other cheek, universal love act as a program for reform.
Exactly. They are not meant to be judged by immediate practical possibilities. Instead, by cherishing these ideals, they enter into the character of our actions. Because we act on them, they slowly attempt to modify our human laws of nature. They alter the communal customs of our society so that our world may gradually conform to a higher defined wisdom.
If our societal laws are just communal customs, that raises a huge question. How much power does the community have over the individual? Which leads us right into the second major section of the text, the aspects of freedom. When you look at the cultural history of Western civilization, you observe a constant historical oscillation between 2 poles.
On one side of the pendulum, there is individual absoluteness. We generally understand this as freedom, the release from essential dependence on other members of the community. You are an atom unto yourself. On the other side, there is individual relativity. This is social organization, the essential, inescapable relatedness of individuals to the state and to each other.
But this shifting of emphasis is not just a matter of changing philosophical fashions. It is intimately driven by the shifting power of dominant classes within a society. The book provides historical examples that make this incredibly clear. Think of it like corporal structures today. Take the 18th century English aristocratic government.
A perfect example.
They were essentially acting like a board of directors trying to keep their biggest shareholders, the great merchants of London and Bristol, happy. Because they were satisfying a trading class. The policy favored free trade, property rights, and being left alone. The emphasis of the society shifted heavily toward personal freedom and individual absoluteness.
Now contrast that with the French government of the exact same era. Their society was fundamentally structured to satisfy the court bureaucracy and the military. Because their active, dominant political element was a massive top-down bureaucracy, the French emphasis naturally leaned heavily toward coordination, social organization, and individual relativity. Everyone had a place within a highly structured system.
To really grasp the mechanics of these historical shifts, the book introduces a triad of human experience that shapes them: instinct, intelligence, and wisdom.
It is a vital framework. Instinct is our primary procedure. It is the mode of experience arising directly out of inheritance, our thoughtless habits, our routines, the things we do without ever asking why. Intelligence, on the other hand, is our intellectual ferment. It is the systematic coordination of notions derived from our instinctive experience. It is the mind waking up and trying to organize the world.
But wisdom is the supreme governing force.
It is. It is the final self-determination that acts as a modifying agency on our intellectual ferment, based on a much broader, deeper, almost intuitive understanding of reality.
You can see this progression in ancient societies. The early Egyptians, for instance, lived almost purely on instinct. Their adaptation to their environment, the flooding of the Nile, their agricultural cycles, their religious obedience, was so pervasive and thoughtless that it went completely unnoticed by the people living it.
They were likely entirely unaware of their own despotic governance because they simply lacked the intellectual distance to even imagine an alternative. In a society ruled by instinct, action, and mood spring entirely from ancestral coordination. In that context, freedom is not suppressed. It is almost a meaningless notion. You cannot desire freedom if you cannot conceive of a life different from your ancestors.
Tracing the chronological discovery of freedom from that point of pure instinct is a fascinating journey. We see flashes of it early on, such as with the Egyptian king Akhenaten. He made an incredible leap in free thought, envisioning a monotheistic, sun-worshipping religion. But he failed completely because he rigidly attempted to impose his new notions upon the entire nation by force. He had the intelligence to conceive of a new idea, but lacked the wisdom to cultivate it naturally.
Later, the Hebrew prophets successfully introduced a profound moral freedom to the world, drastically altering history for the better. They argued that the individual soul had a direct, moral relationship with the divine, separate from the state. Yet, as the text notes, they were plagued by a severe intolerance. They believed they had the absolute truth, and anyone who disagreed was not just wrong, but evil.
And that intolerance is so often the besetting sin of moral fervor, is it not? When you are absolutely convinced of your righteousness, freedom for others seems dangerous.
It is a recurring tragedy in human history. Intolerance supervening upon the exercise of freedom happens over and over. We see it later in the Christian Church, after it gained power under Constantine, and we see it again during the Protestant Reformation, where the persecuted immediately became the persecutors. The emergence of tolerance as an explicit, protected prerequisite for civilization is incredibly rare and hard-won.
The text points to the parable of the tares as the first important pronouncement, where tolerance is associated with moral fervor. For those unfamiliar, it is an agricultural metaphor from the New Testament about letting the weeds, the tares, and the wheat grow together until the harvest, rather than tearing up the field trying to purify it prematurely. It is a profound early argument for letting different beliefs coexist.
And building on that ancient seed, the true modern apostles of tolerance figures like the Renaissance humanist Erasmus, the Quaker movement, and the philosopher John Locke finally articulated why this matters. They understood that imposing one's will upon others, no matter how righteous you feel, is fundamentally a form of intellectual barbarism.
You can contrast this barbarism, this adolescent dream of the Superman imposing his will with an iron fist, with Pericles' Athenian ideal. In Pericles' vision, action in a civilized society is viewed as a beautifully woven texture of persuasion. We talk, we debate, we convince. Plato took this even further, mounting a defense of contemplative freedom. He argued that we must remain tolerant as our finite homage to the inexhaustible novelty of the universe and to the sheer complexity of truth that always inevitably exceeds our grasp.
If we accept that truth is complex and requires tolerance, it leads us to perhaps one of the most vital developments in the modern world: the birth of corporate freedom and institutions.
This is where the narrative becomes incredibly relevant to how we live today. To understand the birth of the institution, we only need to contrast two great historical martyrs, Socrates and St. Paul. Socrates died because his individual speculative opinions were deemed subversive to the communal life of Athens. He was a lone thinker, a gadfly challenging the youth. But St. Paul was an entirely different kind of threat.
St. Paul alarmed the Roman Empire, not merely because of his theology. The Romans were actually quite syncretic and tolerant of various local gods. What caused sheer panic in Rome was that wherever Paul journeyed, he left behind organized, independent groups, churches, operating entirely outside the purposes and oversight of the state.
The state's reaction to this is perfectly encapsulated in the historical letter from the Roman Emperor Trajan to his governor, Pliny. Trajan was largely unconcerned with what the Christians believed in their hearts. What caused absolute panic was the existence of corporate actions and organized groups that fit into no current political philosophy. The state, historically, has always seriously resisted the claim for freedom of corporate action. It wants a monopoly on organization.
The modern world eventually solved this immense tension between the state's desire for control and the individual's need to organize through the creation of professions. You must understand the difference between ancient and modern labor. Ancient societies were dominated by crafts. A craft is an avocation based purely on customary activities, passed down from master to apprentice, relying on the trial and error of individual practice. You do it the way your father did it.
But modern society is a coordination of professions, and a profession is fundamentally different. It is based on theoretical analysis, a deep understanding of the nature of things, and foresight. It requires abstract study, not just physical mimicry.
Because of this transition from custom-based crafts to knowledge-based professions, autonomous institutions began to emerge to protect and regulate that knowledge. Medieval guilds, the great early universities like Oxford and Paris, and the Universal Catholic Church, which transcended all governmental boundaries, claimed an entirely new form of liberty.
It is crucial to redefine what liberty meant in that era. In those days, liberty did not mean a general individual freedom for any person to do whatever they pleased. It meant a special license, a charter, for a particular group to organize itself autonomously within a specific field of action. The university had the liberty to dictate its curriculum. The guild had the liberty to set trade standards. It was the institution that claimed liberty and exercised control, creating a profound, heavy buffer between the individual and the absolute power of the state.
And yet, as we trace this history to the beginning of the 16th century, we find that this great institutional civilization of the Middle Ages, with its complex, interwoven web of guilds, its powerful universities, and its rigid feudal structures, was entering a period of full and rapid decay. The rising new middle classes, the fiercely independent scholars of the Renaissance, and the ambitious global traders began to view these very institutions that had once secured their liberty as a profound, restrictive nuisance.
The buffer had become a cage. They no longer wanted the protection or the oversight of the guildmaster or the church bishop. They craved only good order, reliable laws, and the absolute freedom to be left alone with their own individual activities and ambitions.
Which leaves you to ponder a rather unsettling question as we stand on the precipice of the modern age. What happens to the deeply woven fabric of human wisdom, to the delicate balance of society, when an entire civilization suddenly decides that the collective institutions which built it are now the very things holding it back?
Sitting here with his volume open on the table, it strikes me how rarely we pause to consider the invisible architecture of our own minds. We are looking at Alfred North Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas, and it is a monumental exploration, a very quiet but relentless mapping of how human civilization is driven, shaped, and entirely transformed by the slow, sometimes agonizing, but ultimately triumphant march of ideas.
Yeah, the slow march.
Right. We are not looking at a history of battles or kings here. It is about how a single concept, once entertained by just a few minds, slowly seeps into the bedrock of society and alters the physical world.
It forces a complete reframing of how we view human progress, really. As we continue tracing the threads through these pages and sitting here in this sort of softly lit mental library of ours, we find ourselves looking at a profound tectonic shift.
A massive shift.
We are examining the slow, painful transition from societies governed almost entirely by brute force and raw compulsion to those elevated by mutual persuasion. It is a dawn that takes thousands of years to break, but it redefines our very concepts of freedom, commerce, and foresight. We are essentially watching the human mind, armed only with ideas, slowly begin to conquer the iron laws of physical nature.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the scale of that is almost hard to wrap your head around. Whitehead starts this particular thread by looking at something we take completely for granted today: the modern national state and the evolution of professions.
Right.
He points out something that feels entirely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
As the modern national state emerged out of the Middle Ages, it attempted to dictate every single form of institutional organization. And he views this not as progress, but as a massive retrogression.
A step backward.
Exactly. He calls it a reversion back to the old Roman Empire model, where everything, every single aspect of life, was subordinate to the state. But mankind had outgrown that simplicity?
It helps to look at what it replaced, I think, because the medieval period was incredibly complex. Men owed divided allegiances. You had the church, you had the local feudal lord, you had various mercantile guilds.
It was messy.
It was a tangled web of intersecting institutions, all pursuing diverse ends, keeping each other in a sort of messy balance. So when the modern era introduced the doctrine of sole state sovereignty, this idea that the national state has absolute and final say over everything within its borders, it was actually quite shocking.
A radical shift.
Whitehead argues it was a completely unworkable tool. In its early days, the concept of absolute state sovereignty wasn't some grand philosophical triumph. It was essentially just a political weapon. It was a stick used to beat papists in the 16th and 17th centuries, or a convenient justification to provide policemen to guard the counting houses of wealthy merchants.
And while politicians were playing these games of absolute control, something entirely different was quietly happening on a different level.
Underneath it all.
Right, underneath the nose of the state. The book gives us these visceral examples of how professions transformed. Because early on, a profession wasn't what we think of today. It was mostly just a collection of habits. People occasionally had a bright flash of intelligence, but they always defaulted back to customary procedures.
Just a welter of bygone flashes of intelligence, as he says.
Yeah. Think about the medical field. There is a staggering 1,400-year gap between the medical knowledge of Galen in antiquity and Vesalius during the Renaissance. For over a millennium, there was almost zero progress. People were essentially just memorizing old texts.
This is how we've always done it, essentially.
Exactly. And Whitehead points out this horrifying, almost darkly comedic detail about England's King Charles II.
Oh, the deathbed scene.
Yes. A full century after Vesalius had revolutionized anatomy, the king was essentially tortured on his deathbed by his own royal physicians. They were applying hot irons, bleeding him, and employing utterly futile remedies simply because that was the tradition.
They were bound by custom, not intelligence.
Engineering was much the same. Leonardo da Vinci was unparalleled in his designs, but his genius lapsed back into instinct and custom until the likes of Vauban and James Watt came along centuries later.
What's fascinating here is how the culmination of modern science completely inverted this dynamic. Intelligence finally replaced custom. Instead of looking backward to the supposed wisdom of our ancestors and just applying leeches to a dying king, professions began looking forward.
They demanded facts.
They demanded plausible deductions and objective facts, and by doing so, these professions acquired an international universal life. They formed a shared network of truth, a Catholic league of science that entirely transcended sovereign states. A physicist in England and a physicist in Italy might be technically bound by their respective kings, but their true shared loyalty was to scientific truth.
And that entirely redefines the concept of freedom in relation to the state. In this context, freedom isn't just about the right to shout whatever opinions you want in a public square. It is about learning and ability that is validated by professional consensus.
It changes the boundaries.
The example of the state of Tennessee illustrates this perfectly in the book. The argument here is that Tennessee was not inherently wrong to set administrative limits on what could be taught in its public schools. That is a legal prerogative of a governing body.
Sure, they fund the schools.
But it exhibited gross, staggering ignorance by defying a professional, scientific opinion on evolution that was practically unanimous throughout the world.
It reveals a crucial boundary. The moral authority of any state essentially stops at the frontier of its own incapacity. When a political body presumes to decide upon questions within the purview of specialized universal sciences, it steps entirely outside its legitimate bounds. The state can fund the laboratory, but it cannot dictate the results of the chemistry experiment.
Moving from the state's limits into the realm of economics, the implications get even stranger. We are looking at the massive problem of economic organization and the unexpected collapse of 19th century individualistic liberalism.
That old system made sense when the trading middle classes were the only group that mattered.
Right. But industrialism and mass education produced a modern, massive artisan class that challenged the very foundations of how we organize labor and property. And to manage the sheer scale, legal ingenuity created something that sounds like science fiction when you really think about it.
The modern commercial corporation.
The fictitious person.
Exactly that. A legal entity with limited liability, but crucially, one that is exempt from physiological death.
Right.
A corporation doesn't die of old age. It only disappears by voluntary dissolution or bankruptcy.
Introducing this immortal fictitious person into society fundamentally warped the liberal doctrine of contractual freedom. It is one thing to claim contractual freedom as a natural right for breathing, mortal human beings who get tired, who get sick, who eventually die.
It is quite another to grant those same natural rights to immortal corporate entities with endlessly compounding resources. The power dynamic shifts so drastically that the old definitions of freedom completely break down.
It blurs the lines of what we even consider to be private property. It's like that old argument from Plato's Republic, where Thrasymachus famously defines justice as nothing more than the will of the stronger.
A very cynical view, but a persistent one.
If you were standing at the foot of Mount Sinai or living in a small village in the 18th century, the concept of private property was simple. It was tangible. You had a private well, you had physical gold pieces in your hand, and industry was self-contained.
You could point to it and say, mine.
But today,
Hmm.
with elaborate systems of credit, interconnected global markets, and these immortal corporate entities, private property is mostly a hazy legal fiction. A modern artisan looking at the vast wealth of a multinational corporation might view property exactly the way Thrasymachus did, as arbitrary rules enforced by whoever has the best lawyers or the most power.
That reality dismantles a very shallow sociological idea that is still popular today. The claim that human society shifted cleanly from a customary basis to a contractual one. That we left behind the old world of social castes and inherited status and moved into a purely rational world where free individuals simply sign contracts with one another.
That's a complete illusion, according to the text.
It is. Customary status is an inescapable inheritance that is always imminent. It lives in the background of every single occasion.
Meaning you can't just sign a piece of paper in a vacuum.
Never. Every contract you sign presupposes a massive, invisible background of societal custom. What constitutes a fair wage? What are acceptable working conditions? None of that is invented from scratch in the contract. It is inherited from custom.
And conversely, custom always leaves a loophole for spontaneous contract.
Exactly. This interplay is the very lifeblood of the Anglo-American common law. The law constantly relies on skilled experts to interpret explicit written contracts through the lens of implicit, unwritten social status. No code of verbal statements, no matter how detailed the contract, can ever exhaust the shifting background of human reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Hearing you describe how we're still bound by these invisible customs really messes with how we usually think about individual freedom.
It challenges the standard narrative.
Because affluent literary men, the kinds of people who historically had the time and comfort to write history and philosophy, have largely eviscerated the concept of freedom. Because their bellies were full and their homes were warm, they narrowed freedom to mean merely freedom of thought or freedom of the press.
They assumed that the only real limitations to human freedom were the antagonisms of other people holding different opinions.
But they completely ignored the massive iron laws of physical nature: hunger, cold, disease, death.
Whitehead emphasizes this point heavily. The essence of true freedom is not just being allowed to speak, it is the practicability of purpose. Can you actually achieve what you set out to do, or will you starve to death trying?
The Greek myth of Prometheus perfectly encapsulates this.
Yes. Prometheus did not bring mankind freedom of the press. He brought us fire. He brought the physical ability to cook food, to forge tools, and to stay warm against the biting, indifferent cold of nature. That is primary freedom. Without fire, freedom of speech is just shivering in the dark.
And if we look at the economic interpretation of history for most of human existence, the masses have lived in constant conscious dread of that raw nature. A bad harvest, a summer drought, a cattle disease, a sudden raid by pirates, these physical realities dictated every waking moment.
And survival was the only aim.
But mankind survives through peculiar excitability. We have this strange restless ability, once our basic needs are even marginally met, to divert our energy into ideal ends. Delicacies of taste displace the mere interest as a full stomach. We start caring about art, glory, distant futures, religion.
We build cathedrals instead of just granaries. And this raises an important question because it leads to an even higher level of freedom, one envisioned by Plato, the Stoics, and the early Christians.
A freedom lying beyond circumstance.
Yes. It is derived from the intuition that life can be grounded in what is changeless amidst a chaotic, changing world. It is a state where the soul freely conforms its nature to the supremacy of insight, reconciling freedom with the absolute compulsion of truth.
So if you understand the truth of the universe and you align your will with it, you are no longer being coerced.
Exactly. Think about how reconciling freedom with the compulsion of truth makes even a captive truly free. Their body is bound, but their practicability of purpose, their inner conformity to truth, remains untouched. They take as their own the indwelling persuasion toward the harmony of existence.
That transition from physical force to inner persuasion is the absolute crux of human progress. And we see it play out on a massive societal level when we look at commerce. Commerce, defined in its broadest possible sense, is mutual persuasion where values are purely psychological.
It's all based on belief.
Think about gold currency, or the money in your bank account right now. Its value rests entirely on the habit and belief of mankind, not physical necessity. You can't heat gold. That mutual persuasion is the only thing holding the economy together.
And that purely psychological aspect is precisely where classical 19th century political economy went entirely wrong. Those early economists built their theories on a deeply flawed assumption. They falsely assumed that everyone in the world across all eras behaved exactly like the hard-headed English middle class.
Like perfectly rational calculating machines.
Right, obsessively safeguarding every microscopic detail of their commercial interests. But this false model led to disastrous mentalities like caveat emptor buyer beware regarding adulterated goods. Manufacturers essentially argued if we put poison or sawdust in the bread to make it cheaper, it's the buyer's fault for not being smart enough to test it.
That is incredibly dark.
They insisted on a hard-headed clarity that was actually just a superstition about how human intelligence functions. People rely on trust and custom, not constant paranoid calculation.
Another massive, terrifying oversimplification they relied on was the Malthusian law of population. This is a concept that casts a long, dark shadow over how we view humanity.
The terrifying math.
Malthus observed a brutal mathematical reality. Population grows geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, while food and arable land only grow arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4. The inescapable mathematical conclusion is that human population will always, inevitably, overtake the food supply.
According to Malthus, the unavoidable structure of human society is a tiny, affluent minority resting on the backs of a teeming, semi-destitute mass whose numbers are checked only by starvation, plague, and misery.
And the fascinating thing is that Malthus wasn't entirely wrong. The book notes that his math perfectly described the arrested civilizations of China and India for long, painful stretches of their history. They maintained massive masses sitting perilously near the absolute margin of subsistence.
For half the human race, Malthus provided a painfully accurate interpretation. Where he failed, however, was in predicting the trajectory of Western Europe.
Because they broke the rule.
Completely. Over an 1100-year period, Europe saw a persistently increasing population accompanied by a persistently rising standard of living. And those horrific checks on population that Malthus predicted weren't actually about overpopulation outstripping the food supply.
Right. The plagues and wars weren't about a lack of grain. The Black Death wiped out a third of Europe, but it was about rats, fleas, and a catastrophic lack of soap and drains. The 30 Years' War halved the population of Germany due to incredibly complex political and religious causes, not because the land couldn't physically support the people.
Europe managed to evade the Malthusian trap through 3 actual escape routes. First, expanding commerce, which brought diverse groups together. Second, the development of technology, allowing mankind to transcend unguided nature. And third, the discovery of empty continents, providing vast new physical resources.
When a civilization has those elements, it flourishes. When those cease, a silent blight settles upon the population, and the Malthusian trap snaps shut. That silent blight is exactly what we see when we look at the ancient world, particularly the danger of a society becoming purely defensive.
The contrast there is striking.
It really is. The book draws this vivid picture, contrasting the breathtaking bravery of the early Phoenician sailors with the eventual stagnation of the Western Roman Empire. Look at Hanno's voyage down the trackless coast of Africa. That is a daring, expansive force of life.
Pushing into the unknown.
But compare that to Rome. The Roman Empire failed because after Augustus, it became purely defensive. It lacked the expansive force of life. It hunkered down, trying to hold on to what it had. By 600 AD, Pope Gregory the Great was living in a Western Europe that was fundamentally less civilized than the era of Sophocles or Archimedes hundreds of years prior.
Meanwhile, the triumphs of the Near East during that same period were staggering. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Byzantines, and the Mohammedans, they retained intrinsic energies. They absorbed Hellenism and drove it forward.
But they had a flaw.
A fatal flaw. The civilizations of the Near East relied far too heavily on brute force. It was based on the absolute sway of ruling conquerors over subjects, masters over slaves, and men over women. And the enjoyment of arbitrary power is ultimately fatal to the subtleties of life.
It breeds decadence.
Yes. The text draws a sharp contrast between Solomon's magnificent harem of 1,000 women, a symbol of ultimate, decadent, compulsory power completely barren of progress, and the progressive, world-altering intellectual curiosity of a solitary mind like Euclid or Newton. Pure power doesn't invent calculus.
So while the East eventually succumbed to the reign of force, Europe excitedly armed itself intellectually. It took Greek deductive reasoning, combined it with Christian ethics and a humanitarian respect for life. Even the rough feudal castle was a sensible defensive police mechanism for local districts.
It provided stability.
And from that stability grew commerce, aided by the compass and the printing press, bringing diverse minds together based on free persuasion.
Which brings us to the final concept in our tracing of these ideas: historical foresight. We have to draw a very sharp line between scientific induction, which deals only in generalities, and historical foresight, which requires navigating a surging welter of specific facts.
Because history isn't a repeatable chemistry experiment.
No, it isn't. Despite all our accumulated science, we remain profoundly ignorant of the future, from the collision of stars to our own domestic lives tomorrow morning. The text mentions these fascinating, calculating boys who possess unexplainable mental knacks for arithmetic in a flash, showing how mysterious human faculties of anticipation can be.
So what does this all mean? We can't perfectly predict the future, but we can recognize the vast forces at play. We can summarize the four inexorable factors governing the fate of social groups.
The deep currents.
First, the transcendent aim. Second, the compulsion of physical nature. Third, the strict limitation of man's dominion over man. And fourth, the supreme triumph of persuasion over force.
It leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over. If civilization truly is the victory of persuasion over force, you have to ask yourself, how much of your own daily life, your work, your relationships, your consumption, is still secretly governed by the invisible compulsory forces of our modern era, rather than true mutual persuasion?
A question that sits quietly in the room with us as we turn the page, moving from the broad strokes of historical foresight into the next delicate thread of this historical tapestry, breathing in the dust of ancient empires before we look at what happens when these very ideas begin to physically reshape the modern. We are turning the pages today to explore the profound philosophical foundations of human society. We're looking at the very nature of foresight and how we as a civilization actually understand the intricate laws of nature. It's a quiet, I think, a very profound journey we're taking together today, stepping away from the noise of the day to just examine the machinery of how we live, how we plan, and how we survive.
And to truly grasp these concepts, we have to start by looking at society through a very specific lens. The idea that society is, at its core, an intricate, unimaginably complex machine. And to navigate this machine, we really have to understand the incredibly delicate balance between the mindless routine that keeps the gears turning and visionary foresight, which is what actually tells us where the machine is going.
Right, and I want you, the listener, to just pause for a second and reflect on your own daily routines. Think about the things you do entirely on autopilot. Making your coffee, commuting to work, logging into your computer. Now think about how you adapt when something unexpected disrupts that rhythm.
Like a major road being closed or the internet suddenly going down.
Exactly. Or a sudden life event that shifts your entire landscape. That friction, that exact friction between the expected routine and the unknown disruption, that is the personal, intimate stake that you have in the philosophical journey we're taking right now.
Because that friction is precisely where we find the true definition of foresight. We often talk about navigating the unknown as if it requires some magical knack. There's this cultural assumption that foresight is an innate intuition, a mystical divining rod that some people are just lucky enough to be born with.
But the philosophical premise here in the book is quite different. It argues that foresight is entirely a habit, and it's a habit born exclusively out of understanding.
Which reframes how we view intelligence entirely. I mean, if foresight is just a habit of understanding, it means that anyone with a general aptitude can actually be trained in it.
You just have to be trained to understand the complex systems around you.
Right, but the opposite of the act of understanding, the mechanism that allows us to survive without having to constantly think and analyze every single second of our day, is routine. Routines is the god of every social system.
It's the seventh heaven of business, really.
The absolute ideal of every statesman. I mean, think about how a society is supposed to run like clockwork. Take the judicial system, for example. In a perfect routine, every crime is seamlessly followed by an arrest.
And every arrest by a judicial trial.
And every trial by a conviction, every conviction by a punishment, and every punishment magically results in a reformed character. It is envisioned as this unbroken chain of events that requires no profound thought, just execution.
There's another striking analogy presented in the book that I think perfectly illustrates this, the car manufacturing process. You start with the raw iron ore in the earth and the coal deep in the mine. And through a perfectly orchestrated routine, that raw material travels through thousands of hands until it ends up as a shiny new car driving out of the factory.
And at the very top of this chain, the august president of the corporation signs dividend warrants and renews contracts with the mining corporations. Everyone, from the humblest miner to the president, is trained for a highly specific, narrow job.
And this is where the philosophy gets a bit unsettling, honestly. In that perfect routine, true understanding is actually eliminated. It is replaced by conditioned reflexes.
Because the miner down in the dark doesn't need to understand the corporate dividend structure. And the president in the boardroom certainly doesn't need to know how to swing a pickaxe or extract coal.
When the routine reaches perfection, intelligence vanishes from the daily operation. It's replaced entirely by this massive coordination of reflexes.
So if everyone, from the miner to the CEO, is essentially operating on a conditioned reflex, the question becomes, who is actually steering the machine? Is anyone actively thinking?
In a flawless routine, no one is. The only time you actually need a flash of active intelligence is to deal with an accident, a flooded mine, a sudden drought, a global epidemic. When the routine breaks, intelligence must step in to repair it.
Which brings up a fascinating, almost haunting comparison to insect societies. Think of the ants or the bees.
Yes, the book goes into this, and it's brilliant.
They have survived for tens of thousands, perhaps millions of years, and they have incredibly complex class systems. They have their workers, their warriors, their janitors, their queens, and they do all of this purely on perfect routine, without a shred of what we would call conscious understanding of their ultimate purpose.
We often make the arrogant mistake of thinking it takes high-grade human intelligence to build an elaborate social organization. The insects prove that completely false. A perfect society can be built on mindless routine.
But the insect societies have one glaring characteristic that separates them from us. They are not progressive. Mankind's defining trait, whether we are moving from worse to better or better to worse, is progressiveness.
And that human drive for progress, the very thing that separates us from those stagnant, perfectly routinized insect colonies, is also what breaks our routines. Because we progress, our environment changes. And when the environment changes, the old routines fail.
That is exactly why we are forced to demand foresight. And the urgency of that demand has changed drastically because the timeline of human progress is compressing. It's a shrinking time span.
If you look at the deep past, the time span for a massive physical change, like mountains rising or continents shifting, was on the order of millions of years.
A gradual shift in climate took perhaps 5,000 years.
Even in the pre-scientific ages, new technologies, like the transition to chipping flints or taming animals, had a time span of about 500 years between major shifts. So for the vast majority of human history, day-to-day life was stagnant.
If you compare the Roman Empire around 100 AD to the close of the Middle Ages around 1400 AD, there is practically no advance in basic technology. Life in the 18th century felt so fundamentally similar to ancient Rome that classical Latin literature was still vividly relevant to their daily lives.
But then came the sudden violent rush, the Steam Age.
Right. Between 1780 and 1830, inventions didn't just appear. They came rushing into effective operation. The steam engine, mechanized looms, the beginnings of railways. The time span of important change began to violently collapse from centuries down to decades.
Which leads to a truly momentous conclusion in the book. For all of human history, across all those vast epochs, society operated on a single, unbroken assumption that a child would live in the exact same conditions as their parents and their grandparents before them.
We are living in the very first period of human history where that assumption is entirely fundamentally false. And the shattering of that assumption means the death of the simple economic man.
The traditional political economy was built on this theoretical economic man, a simplified human who had the exact same wants, needs, and environment as his grandfather.
Let's paint a picture of that for a moment. Imagine an 18th century blacksmith. He made the exact same horseshoes using the exact same tools for the exact same types of horses as his grandfather did.
If there was a shortage of iron, everyone in the town knew exactly how to react, because the conditions were stable and well-tried.
Precisely. But contrast that blacksmith with a modern worker whose entire industry might be rendered obsolete by artificial intelligence in a single decade. Because our world is now completely fluid and novel, those old, rigid maxims and rules of thumb spell absolute ruin.
The reliable businessman who just masters a single technique and never looks beyond his contracted horizon is obsolete. A much deeper, Philosophical knowledge of human nature is required to determine how people will react to the unprecedented novelty that each new decade introduces.
You can see this shifting landscape clearly when you look at the very geography of how we live, especially in our cities. Throughout the whole span of civilization, cities formed out of pure necessity.
They were condensed aggregates of humans. We built them for defense behind thick city walls, for the concentration of physical and heat energy, for the ease of face-to-face business relations, and for the cultural opportunities of having everyone in one place.
But modern technology has systematically erased the original reasons for cities to exist. Mechanical power and electricity can now be transmitted over hundreds of miles. You don't need to live next to the waterfall or the coal mine to run a factory anymore.
We communicate instantaneously by telephone or video. Leaders can cross continents in airplanes. Culture, music, and speeches are broadcast directly into any home, anywhere.
There's a very specific, real-world example of this shift discussed in the book regarding England. The first industrial age concentrated the Angler population in the north, crowded around the coal fields because that was where the physical energy was.
But with new technologies and the transmission of electric power, that necessity vanished. The population and manufacturing are naturally shifting away from those northern coal fields, moving down to the southern ports near the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, driven purely by the freedom of new technologies.
For you, the listener, sitting in your own changing landscape, the implication is profound. Those who use foresight to understand these deep underlying geographical and technological shifts will thrive. They will adapt to where the world is naturally flowing.
But those who blindly rely on the past routines, who assume the northern coal fields will always be the center of the world simply because they always have been, will fail. So the question is, who is managing this fluid, dispersing world? What kind of mind is needed to navigate this future?
The book speaks of the philosophic business mind. It is very careful to point out that the business world is not some separate abstract entity divorced from the rest of the community. Business actually dominates the behavior of the community. A great society requires business leaders who think greatly of their functions.
It explicitly warns against the robber baron mentality, the short-sighted motives of mere exploitation. Those who extract wealth without understanding the system are the ones who destroy the sources of their own prosperity and cause devastating trade depressions.
Low thoughts in leadership mean low behavior, and low behavior leads to a descending standard of life for everyone involved. To elevate that behavior, we have to use philosophy as a practical tool.
And we should redefine that word for a moment, because when we say philosophy here, we are not talking about irritable professors ferociously debating obscure texts in a vacuum.
Right, and we aren't talking about someone showering their employees with a deluge of noble sentiments and empty inspirational quotes either.
Philosophy, in this practical context, is the unspecialized aptitude to elicit generalizations from particulars. It is the ability to step back and weigh facts, theories, alternatives, and ideals all together.
It's looking at society from the standpoint of generality, remaining completely undaunted by novelty. It is the ultimate tool for foresight because it allows you to see the pattern in the chaos.
And to truly understand how this philosophic mind developed, we have to shift our gaze back to the origins of scientific thought. The DNA of Western civilization traces back to three distinct ancestors.
First, Egypt, which provided mature technology and practical crafts born of 3,000 years of secure civilization. Second, Palestine, which provided the final religious cosmology. And third, Greece, which provided logical lucidity and the clear-cut generalizations that led directly to philosophy and science.
Within that Greek influence, there is a fascinating, almost tragic cultural shift that perfectly illustrates the tension between foresight and routine. It is the transition from Athens to Alexandria.
From the Hellenic era to the Hellenistic era, Athens was the era of pure speculation. It was defined by a delight in open discourse and an untroubled, almost naive faith that the universe is penetrable by reason.
It was an era that embraced the mysterious and sought to understand it through grand, intuitive leaps. Let's ground that in a modern analogy. Athens is like the brilliant, chaotic energy of a startup founder having a wild, late-night idea that disrupts an entire industry. It is pure, rash speculation.
But then, as political barriers collapsed and empires shifted, the intellectual capital moved to Alexandria, and this became the era of scholarship. These thinkers are described as duller, thicker intellects who abandoned that grand, sweeping speculation.
Instead, they created special, confined sciences. They stabilized learning by establishing rigid methodologies, writing exhaustive textbooks, and obsessing over limited, hyper-specific accuracy. They conventionalized learning to secure it.
Alexandria is the corporate lawyers and middle managers who come into that startup 5 years later to write the HR manuals and standardize the product.
It feels restrictive, but human progress actually requires the endless strife between these two forces. You need rash, intuitive speculation, which is superficially skeptical and deeply disturbing to established prejudice because that is the force that discovers new things.
But you also need rigid scholarship, which leans toward conservative belief and pins knowledge down into isolated regions, because that is the force that secures and conventionalizes those discoveries so they survive the winter.
That urge to secure knowledge, to pin down the chaotic universe into something predictable, brings us to the very birth of the concept of law. And the transition here is vividly evocative. Imagine an ape-man in the prehistoric brush, grabbing a stone to use as a weapon.
That ape-man is living entirely in the present moment, reacting to an immediate visceral stimulus. He has no reflection on the course of nature beyond the next few desperate minutes.
But the moment a human being puts a seed into the earth and waits for a season, civilization crosses a massive, monumental divide. That farmer is no longer living just in the present.
Agriculture forced humanity to look months ahead. It moved us from a passive acceptance of the weather, where you simply endure the rain and suffer through the drought, to an active, desperate search for precautions and understanding.
Humanity was suddenly required to predict the harvest. The capriciousness of the weather became a literal matter of life and death, and this desperate need to predict the seasonal phases is what gave birth to the concept of the laws of nature.
And we need to take our time here to carefully and thoroughly analyze what a law of nature actually is. Because it is not just one simple idea. There are four competing doctrines, four entirely different philosophies of law that have shaped human thought.
The first is the doctrine of law as immanent. Let's unpack that word. Immanent means existing or operating within. This philosophy suggests that the order of nature simply expresses the inherent characters of the real things themselves.
Everything in the universe is essentially interdependent. Because things share common elements in their character, they will naturally behave in patterned ways. The laws aren't rules, they are the habits of the universe.
And because this doctrine is based on the evolving character of things, it perfectly allows for statistical lapses. For example, in quantum mechanics, individual electrons can be entirely unpredictable.
You cannot enforce a rigid rule on a single electron. Many laws of physics are actually just statistical averages of behavior. The law isn't an iron grid placed over reality, it's just a reflection of the evolving nature of the things involved. If nature evolves, the immanent laws must evolve with it.
Now, contrast that deeply organic view with the second doctrine, law as imposed. This is the idea of external relations. It argues that things exist completely independently of one another.
A rock is a rock, a planet is a planet, and they require nothing but themselves to exist. Therefore, the rules of their interactions must be forced upon them from the outside.
So if immanent means the rules come from within, imposed means they come from outside, like a dictator handing down a law to a population. This is a deeply deistic view.
Yes, think of the universe as a giant wind-up clock. A deistic view means a creator. The clockmaker wound up the clock, set the exact mathematical rules, and stepped back. The rules are forced onto the gears from the outside. They don't emerge from the brass of the gears themselves.
This was the view held by giants like Descartes and Newton. And what is so striking is the psychological necessity of this view. Without this initial implicit belief in an imposed exact law, early scientists would never have had the hope or the motivation to even start looking for order.
Imagine looking at the terrifying, chaotic, seemingly demonic universe of the ancient world. If they didn't believe an exact law was hidden there, purposefully placed by a creator, they wouldn't have spent their lives relentlessly searching for it.
The belief in the imposed law was the psychological crutch that birthed modern science.
Then we arrive at the third view, which is the positivist doctrine, or law as observed order. This view sidesteps all the deep metaphysics. It abandons the clockmaker and the inherent habits entirely. It states that laws are merely descriptions of what we observe happening over and over again. There is no underlying why.
So under this positivist view, when Newton formulated his law of gravitation, he wasn't actually explaining gravity.
Exactly. Newton enunciated a mathematical formula describing the exact correlation of masses and distances, but he explicitly refused to explain why gravity happens. He was simply stating, I observed this and I observed that, and here is the persistent mathematical pattern of the facts.
It is pure description. It doesn't claim to know the metaphysical truth.
Right.
It only claims to know the pattern.
And finally, there is the fourth doctrine, law as conventional interpretation. We won't linger on it, but it suggests that the laws we see are just the conventional ways our specific human minds interpret the universe.
It acts as a gateway, leading us away from strict physics and into much deeper, older cosmological questions about the very nature of existence itself.
Which flows seamlessly into the ancient cosmologies, and specifically Plato's definition of being. When you strip away all the routines, all the cities, all the applied sciences, you are left with the fundamental question of what it means to exist.
It is a thought that resonates in the quiet spaces of the mind. Plato suggests that the very definition of being is simply power. It is the power to affect another thing, or the power to be affected by another thing, even for the briefest, most infinitesimal moment.
Nothing exists as an everlasting fixture in awful unmeaningness. A rock sitting alone in the dark void isn't truly being if it interacts with nothing. To exist at all is to be intimately implicated in action and reaction, to be woven into the fabric of everything else.
To exist is to affect and to be affected. I invite you to just sit with that thought. Let the weight of that profound interconnectedness settle into your mind as we reflect on the nature of our own existence.
You are sitting in the quiet dark, perhaps looking up at the night sky right now, and you realize that the way you understand that vastness, the very laws you believe hold it all together, completely dictates how you live your life down here on Earth.
It really does, and we are currently suspended right in the middle of this thought.
We are. We're entering part 5 of our continuous 10-part journey through the book Adventures of Ideas. And our mission in this very moment is to carefully unpack a historical battle that has been raging for millennia.
A very quiet but incredibly consequential battle.
Exactly. It's the battle between different concepts of the laws of nature and how these overarching ideas about the universe or cosmologies have actively shaped our civilization, our science, and our fundamental understanding of reality.
It's a profound place to find ourselves, isn't it?
It is.
Because when we look at this historical tug of war regarding the laws of nature, we're really looking at two extreme doctrines that have pulled at the human mind since we first started asking questions about the stars. On one hand, you have the doctrine of imposed law, and on the other, the doctrine of immanent law.
Let's pause right there and make sure we have a solid grip on those two concepts because they sound a bit dense at first glance.
They do, yes.
If I'm understanding the book correctly, imposed law is essentially the idea of a transcendent creator dictating the rules of the universe entirely from the outside. Like a cosmic traffic cop or a monarch laying down decrees. The universe is just raw material and it simply obeys commands handed down from an external supreme authority.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. This concept draws heavily from early Semitic monotheism. The law is not a part of the material itself. It is forced upon it from above.
Right.
But then you have the complete opposite approach with immanent law. This is the pantheistic idea that the laws of the universe aren't imposed from the outside at all. Instead, they are the internal, inherent characteristics of the things themselves.
So under immanent law, a seed grows into a tree not because it was ordered to do so by some external gravitational or divine force, but because the law of its growth is woven right into its very DNA. It's an internal instinct rather than an external command.
Precisely. And what is so compelling about this historical division is that even the greatest minds in human history struggled to pick a side.
Plato being the prime example.
Yes, take Plato. In his famous dialogue, the Timaeus, he completely wavers between these two doctrines. On one page, he describes a shadowy, undefined creator imposing a grand design upon the chaotic universe.
Like a sculptor forcing clay into a shape.
Exactly. But then, in the exact same breath, he talks about the internal flux of the world, describing a reality where, as he puts it, nothing was given off from it. Nothing entered it. There was nothing but itself.
He couldn't fully commit to the traffic cop, but he couldn't fully commit to the internal instinct either. He was just caught in the middle.
He was. But while Plato was wrestling with this fusion of imposed and immanent law, ancient Greek thought was quietly incubating a completely rival cosmology, which was the atomic theory.
I find this part so fascinating.
It is. This was envisioned by Democritus, systematized later by Epicurus, and then beautifully transformed into an epic poem by the Roman philosopher Lucretius.
I really want us to spend a moment on Lucretius because the imagery he uses is just hauntingly beautiful. According to him, the world isn't governed by a shadowy creator, and it isn't guided by some immanent soul. Instead, he asks you to imagine the universe as an interminable, endless shower of atomic particles.
Just a silent cosmic rainstorm of matter in the dark void.
Exactly. They stream through the void of space, swerving, intermingling, disentangling, and recombining. And the wildest part of his theory is that all the qualitative differences in the world around you right now, the color of the sky, the texture of the chair you are sitting on, the sound of my voice, Lucretius argued that all of these are merely the statistical expression of the geometrical patterns of these intermingled atomic paths.
It is a breathtakingly modern view of physics, and it was written thousands of years ago. He describes these atoms falling downward through the deep void like drops of rain.
But, and this is the crucial part, if they just fall straight down like rain, nothing ever touches, nothing ever happens.
Right, they would just remain peril forever.
Which is where Lucretius introduces a concept that absolutely blew my mind when I read it in the book: the swerve. He theorized that at entirely uncertain times and in completely uncertain spots, these falling atoms push themselves just a tiny microscopic bit from their straight course.
That little swerve changes everything.
It changes the entire universe, because if they didn't have this unpredictable swerve, they would just fall forever in parallel lines. There would be no clashing, no combining into molecules, no planets, no oceans. As Lucretius puts it, thus nature never would have produced aught.
Without that random little mistake, that swerve, you and I wouldn't exist to have this conversation right now.
It's staggering to think about.
It is the ancient introduction of chance into the mechanics of reality. And that thread of chance leads us directly to a modern philosophical framework we need to discuss, which is the positivist school of thought.
We definitely need to cover positivism.
Because positivism is a doctrine that absolutely dominates the way modern science operates today.
Let's clearly define positivism for anyone listening, because it sounds a bit like an optimistic self-help movement, but it's actually incredibly rigid.
It is very rigid. Positivism aims to confine human knowledge strictly and entirely to observed facts. It discards all metaphysical speculation. It simply doesn't care about what might be invisible or what the ultimate purpose of things might be.
It just looks at what is right in front of it.
Right. A strict positivist looks at the atomic theory of Lucretius, and they seize upon the random paths of the molecules. To them, the paths are entirely disconnected, random distributions. The world as we know it is just a concatenation of circumstances that have risen entirely by chance. We can describe what has happened, but according to positivism, with that description, all possibility of true knowledge ends. We cannot know why.
And this ties right into the philosopher David Hume, doesn't it? Particularly his epistemology. And just as a quick aside for you listening, epistemology is really just a fancy philosophy term for the study of how we know what we know.
Exactly. Hume took the physical atomism of Epicurus and Lucretius, and he turned it into a mental atomism. Hume argued that our minds are just a shower of subjective sensory impressions.
So when you look at an apple, you aren't experiencing the truth of the apple.
No, you are experiencing a distinct impression of red, a distinct impression of roundness, a distinct impression of sweetness. You experience these associated memories and expectations, but each impression is just an isolated existence arising from totally unknown causes.
But wait, hold on. I have to push back on this positivist view on behalf of anyone listening in the dark right now. If the positivist stance is that the universe's incredible, staggering order is just random chance, how do they defend that?
It's a fair question.
When you look at the complexity of the human eye, or the intricate orbits of remote star galaxies, or the evolution of life, it feels nearly impossible to just shrug and say, well, total accident.
It is a massive hurdle, and the positivists have two main philosophical defenses. First, they point to the sheer scale of reality. They argue that we are dealing with infinite time and infinite space.
Yeah, go on.
Now, if you take a finite region of space with a finite cargo of atoms, a specific, highly complex arrangement does seem infinitely improbable. But we aren't dealing with limits. With infinite time and infinite space, absolutely any arrangement, no matter how complex or seemingly purposeful, is not only possible but statistically inevitable. Given enough time, the atoms will randomly fall into the shape of a human eye.
And their second defense.
The second defense is much simpler and a bit humbling. We only observe a tiny, sporadic, incredibly rough fraction of the universe anyway. We exist for a cosmic blink on a speck of dust. We shouldn't exaggerate the overall order of the entire cosmos based on our incredibly limited local viewpoint.
That makes sense logically, but the book points out a massive flaw in relying solely on this strict positivistic descriptive view. And it uses this brilliant metaphor that I really want us to chew on for a minute: the statistics apple.
Yes.
People today often think the complex math of statistics helps positivism predict the real physical future, but math only tells you the consequences of your existing beliefs.
This is a crucial distinction. Let's really break down the apple metaphor.
Right. So the book explains it like this. Let's say you believe an apple is composed of a finite number of physical atoms. Because you hold that belief, mathematics can step in and absolutely guarantee you that the number of atoms in that apple is either an odd number or an even number. The math is flawless. But here's the catch. Mathematics cannot provide you with the apple itself.
It cannot give you the atoms, it cannot prove their finiteness, and it certainly cannot tell you what the apple actually tastes like.
Exactly. You cannot infer concrete, living nature from mere mathematical possibility. Math is just a language describing relationships. It is not the physical dirt, water, and seed that makes the fruit.
And to truly understand the limits of just describing things mathematically, which is all positivism allows, we must confront it with the actual history of real science. I want you to consider the story of the Lowell Observatory in Arizona and the discovery of a new planet.
This is such a great example of where strict positivism completely fails.
It really is. Astronomers at the observatory were closely monitoring the orbits of Uranus and Neptune. As they mapped the paths of these massive planets, they noticed something strange. Uranus and Neptune were wobbling. They were deviating slightly from their calculated, mathematically perfect paths.
They weren't doing what the math said they should do.
Exactly. Now let's play this out. If these astronomers were strict, pure positivists, what would they have done in that moment?
If they were pure positivists, they would have looked at the wobble, written a new, slightly more complex mathematical formula to describe the deviations, said, well, that fits the newly observed facts, and then gone to lunch. Positivism would have exhausted its entire message right there. Near description, the wobble is just what happens.
Precisely. But thankfully for human progress, they were not satisfied with mere description. Instead, they engaged in what the book calls speculative extension. They took a leap of faith. The astronomer Percy Lowell trusted the law of gravitation so deeply that he assumed it applied into the dark, unseen void of space. He calculated that there must be an imaginary, massive point moving in the blackness, far beyond Neptune, physically pulling on those planets.
He predicted where it should be, even though there was zero observed fact that it actually existed.
Yes, and when humanity finally saw that new planet, when they finally found Pluto, it wasn't by magic. It was through the intervention of photography, magnificent telescopes, and the laws of light.
And here's the kicker. Trusting a telescope or a photographic plate requires its own massive leap of faith. You are trusting that the laws of optics and light hold true across billions of miles of empty, freezing space. You're trusting that the photon hitting your lens behaved exactly as you assume it did for its entire journey.
Which is the deep metaphysical trust in the permanence of material things.
So, if we bring this back to you, listening to us right now, why does this matter? It means that without this metaphysical trust, without a burning desire for an explanatory description rather than just a shallow physical one, scientific progress completely halts.
It stops entirely.
If we don't assume the universe makes sense behind the curtain, we stop looking. Apart from metaphysical presupposition, there is no civilization.
And historically, where did scientists get that baseline belief that the universe made sense? That search for explanation brings us straight into the deep theological and logical frameworks that stabilized our early understanding of the cosmos. During the first few centuries of the modern era, theologians wrestled intensely with these concepts of law.
And just to be clear for anyone listening, we aren't debating the actual theology or religious validity here. We're just looking at how these different religious frameworks became the literal blueprints that early thinkers used to map out the physical universe.
Exactly. It's about the cosmology they produced. For example, the Alexandrian theologians heavily emphasized the immanence of God. They promoted the idea that the physical things in nature actually share in the nature of an immanent dwelling God. The physical world was infused with the divine.
Which is such a stark contrast to the Augustinian or the later rigid Calvinistic views. Those frameworks lean heavily toward a wholly transcendent God who imposed his arbitrary will onto the world entirely from the outside. The book even likens Calvin's strict version to the old Manichaean doctrine.
And Manichaeism, for those unfamiliar, was the ancient idea of a wholly evil, corrupt, material world. Matter itself was intrinsically bad, and it could only be partially rescued or managed by God's arbitrary selection and external rules.
It's imposed law taken to its absolute extreme. The universe is a bad, chaotic place that must be forced into order.
This theological wavering eventually found a massive new stabilization in the 17th century, with figures like Sir Isaac Newton and the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Newton adopted the most simple-minded, straightforward version of imposed law. He believed in Lucretius's material atoms and the void, but he took it a step further. He saw the void as the literal sensorium of God.
The sensorium, meaning space itself is basically the sensory organ of the divine.
Yes. God was the transcendent imposer of the gravitational forces across this space. It was a cosmology that was incredibly easy to conceptualize, even if it was hard to philosophically defend, and it pragmatically ruled scientific thought for 200 years.
But Leibniz took a different path. And to understand why Leibniz disagreed with Newton, we have to quietly unpack the tragic flaw of Aristotelian logic. The book uses this beautifully simple bathtub analogy to explain it. Imagine you are drawing a bath, you put your hand in, and you say the sentence, "This water is hot." According to Aristotle's classical logic, you are separating reality into two completely distinct things. A primary substance, which is the specific mass of water in that particular bathtub, and an abstract quality, which is being hot.
It seems like a perfectly lucid, normal way to describe the world.
Right, but the profound flaw, a flaw that haunted philosophy for 2,000 years, is that this logic completely leaves out the real interconnections between things. By defining a thing purely by its private bundle of abstract characteristics, you conceive of it as entirely complete in itself. The water is just water, the heat is just heat. You accidentally shiver the universe into a multitude of disconnected, isolated realities.
As the book so poetically states, under this logic, a substantial thing cannot call into a substantial thing. They are fundamentally deaf and blind to one another.
It is an incredibly lonely way to view the universe. Everything is completely isolated. And Leibniz, recognizing this isolation, proposed his famous theory of windowless monads. Let's define that, because it's a wild concept. Leibniz imagined the universe as a collection of ultimate individual atomic subjects. He called them monads. But because he was stuck in that Aristotelian isolation, he argued that these monads had no windows to look out of. They couldn't directly interact with one another at all.
They were perfectly sealed off.
So how does anything happen? Leibniz's solution was that these windowless monads could only communicate indirectly through God via a pre-established harmony. It's like billions of clocks that never touch each other but strike at the exact same time because the clockmaker wound them all up perfectly at the beginning.
It is perhaps the most extreme example of imposed law ever conceived. But if we connect this back to the ancient cosmologies, both Plato and Lucretius actually managed to evade this tragedy of disconnection. Lucretius had his void, and Plato had a concept called the receptacle.
Which we will get to in a moment because it's vital.
Right. Both the void and the receptacle weren't just empty nothingness. They inherently provided a medium for real, essential communication. They insisted that the interconnectedness of things wasn't an accident or a pre-programmed clockwork, but a foundational physical part of reality.
Which brings us to a fascinating, somewhat unsettling modern shift in how we view the laws of nature. It's called the doctrine of conventional interpretation. This is the idea that the laws of nature might just be conventional interpretations that happen to interest us rather than absolute truths. Let's look at geometry, for instance. Modern mathematicians have proven that you can apply Euclidean, elliptic, or hyperbolic geometry to the exact same physical space, just by changing your fundamental definition of distance.
The implications of that are staggering. It means that an infinite number of alternative geometrical systems can hold true simultaneously in the very room you're sitting in right now.
Let's make this real for a second. Think about your commute to work or a long hike. If you say, "I just walked 30 miles, you could mathematically be talking about 30 Euclidean miles or 30 elliptic miles. Depending on the math you choose to apply, those translate to totally different physical spaces. As the book jokes, every legislature should anxiously settle the exact metric system it means to adopt before writing a law.
That's a great point.
But, and here is the crucial anchor to reality, the physical exhaustion you feel in your legs after walking those 30 miles remains a hard, undeniable fact of nature. You can change the geometric convention all you want, but the reality of the physical world remains stubborn.
And ignoring that stubborn reality in favor of our self-made concepts leads to what the book calls the dogmatic fallacy.
Oh, I love this part.
It is incredibly important. The dogmatic fallacy is the dangerous, arrogant belief that our current scientific or philosophical concepts are perfectly defined and final. We look at animals and we see they experience life through instinct and routine. But humans strive for abstract principles. We want to categorize the universe perfectly. Aristotle, for instance, gave us an ancient, majestic classification of gravity.
This is one of my favorite historical scientific theories because it makes so much logical sense, even though it's completely backward. Aristotle said, heavy things naturally tend downward because they want to go to the center of the earth. Flames naturally tend upward because they want to go to the heavens. And stars move in perfect circular motions because they are incorruptible and divine.
It was a brilliantly logical, function-based classification.
It's brilliant. You have to respect the sheer confidence of it. It was completely wrong, of course, but it was a masterclass in trying to understand the world based on the observed functions of things. The danger is when we think we've finished the job and no longer need to question our assumptions.
Precisely. Think about the 17th century concept of the material body, the hard, solid, Newtonian physical object. That concept reigned supreme and unquestioned for 300 years. It was considered the absolute truth. It transformed human thought. It built the Industrial Revolution. And then in the 20th century, with the dawn of quantum physics, that solid concept completely collapsed. It turned out matter was mostly empty space and probability waves.
It serves as a profound warning against finality. Science abstracts the facts, isolating certain variables to understand them. Philosophy's task is to seek the generalities that characterize the complete, concrete reality. They must constantly mutually criticize each other. The book provides a striking metaphor for this that I can't stop thinking about. It says philosophical ideas are like obscure microbes or undocumented species lurking in a lonely, forgotten jungle for ages.
A very vivid image.
They wait there in the dark, mutating, growing, and then, by some trick of historical circumstance, they escape into the outer world and completely transform or even destroy a civilization.
And the greatest cultivator of these ideas, the person who released some of the most potent microbes into human history, was Plato, particularly in his maturer, later thought. He left us with a cosmological system that was wavering, undogmatic, but undeniably brilliant. We should walk through the most vital parts of it. First, the ideas.
Right. Plato saw the ideas as the static, frozen templates of reality, determined by their compatibilities and incompatibilities. They are the blueprints, but blueprints alone are lifeless. They don't build a house. So he introduced his second notion, the psyche.
The living intelligence. Plato conceived of a basic psyche, a supreme craftsman whose active entertainment of these ideas conditions the entire process of the universe. It is the agency that brings the frozen ideas into the creative, moving advance of time. But importantly, this craftsman is not entirely omnipotent like the Calvinist God. The influence of these ideas is persuasive. The craftsman is trying to coax order out of a chaotic reality, not forcing it.
And what drives that persuasion? Why does the universe want to be ordered? This leads to the third notion, which is my absolute favorite part, the eros. Plato didn't view knowledge or order as just cold, academic understanding. He saw the entertainment of ideas as an inward ferment, a subjective feeling, a passionate urge toward ideal perfection. Eros is the energetic craving of the universe itself to realize beauty and order.
And for the ancient Greeks, that beauty was deeply, intrinsically tied to harmony in mathematics. There's the famous story of Archesis, who discovered that the beautiful, qualitative sound of a stretched string depends purely on its exact mathematical length.
Which doesn't sound like a big deal to us today, but back then it wasn't just a musical discovery, it was a cosmological revelation.
It was proof that math and physical sensation were permanently linked.
It's astounding. They connected the beautiful sounds of a lyre to the proportional, geometric dimensions used in architecture, like the pillars of the Parthenon. And they tied all of that back to the ancient Babylonian calendars that tracked the qualitative change of the seasons using pure numbers of days. They realized for the first time that mathematical relations literally govern the physical, emotional world. The qualitative facts of our lives, the music we hear, the seasons we feel, are intertwined with geometric composition.
Which leads us finally to Plato's most difficult, yet perhaps his most profound concept, the receptacle. In trying to understand the general interconnectedness of things, Plato realized there must be a medium, a grand matrix where all this math and matter interacts. The receptacle is intrinsically devoid of all geometric forms itself. It is obscure. It is completely formless.
He called it the foster mother of all becoming. It is the ultimate proof that the universe is an interconnected process. It is the reason that every single physical actuality is a component in the nature of every other actuality. It is the medium of intercommunication that Leibniz's windowless monads so desperately needed.
It is the reason that the universe is not just a collection of lonely, isolated things, but a unified matrix where the movement of an atom, the random swerve in the void, the gravitational pull of an unseen planet, and the thoughts in our minds all participate in the exact same grand reality.
As you sit there in the dark, breathing quietly, consider that formless matrix. Consider that the receptacle is actively connecting the quiet thoughts currently firing in your mind to the furthest, unseen planets orbiting in the deepest reaches of the cosmos. How is that invisible eros, that ancient inward ferment striving for perfection, operating within the quiet spaces of your own life at this exact fleeting second?
And that realization brings us even deeper into the quiet, almost overwhelming architecture of Alfred North Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas. If you have been carrying the weight of the rigid mechanical universe we have explored so far in these pages, prepare yourself to just let that weight go. We're moving away from the rigid certainty of old science, that comfortable but limiting framework, and we are stepping gently into a space of profound, almost fragile interconnectedness. We're going to trace how this shifting reality of the physical universe demands that our philosophical and religious thought must also evolve to match it. Okay, let's unpack this.
It is a profound shift, and to really understand the magnitude of it, we are asked to look backward to the ancient Greeks, specifically to the contrast between Aristotle and Plato. For the longest time, Aristotle's classifications of the visible universe were considered the absolute pinnacle of perfect scientific induction. His methods were rooted in observed facts, things you could see, touch, and neatly categorize.
Right.
And for 1,800 years, that approach ruled human thought. It was incredibly useful for its time. But as this argument points out so quietly and brutally, that Aristotelian doctrine is now dead. It is, to use the exact phrasing, a stone-dead archaeological curiosity. It lost its utility because it only cared about the surface of things, and eventually it became an obstruction to human understanding. But Plato, who was often criticized for ignoring practical observation in favor of abstract thought, offered something far more prescient. He gave us the concept of the receptacle, which he called the foster mother of all becoming.
The foster mother of all becoming. It is such a beautiful, haunting phrase. Plato was suggesting a necessary community, a subtle, invisible background within which all the events of history and nature are set. And the text draws our attention to this because in a stunning twist of history, modern physical science is currently closer to Plato's receptacle than at any period since Plato's death. The space-time of modern mathematical physics, when you strip away the specific events happening within it, is almost exactly this Platonic receptacle.
Yes, and to reach this understanding, Plato insisted on the study of mathematics, not just as a tool for measuring crops or building bridges, but as the very key to unlocking the mysteries of nature's interconnectedness. He believed that the mathematical relations hidden beneath the surface of reality were the truest expressions of harmony.
I mean, the historical journey of that mathematical key is fascinating in its own right. The Greeks, the Egyptians, the Arabs, the Jews, and the Mesopotamians all took this mathematical torch and advanced it far beyond Plato's wildest dreams.
They did. Yet there is a very curious historical limitation noted in these pages. This profound pursuit was notably absent among the early Christian populations. For centuries before the Renaissance, the Christian world largely ignored mathematics or, tragically, confused it with magic. The text mentions Pope Sylvester II, who reigned in the year 1000. He studied mathematics, but he added absolutely nothing to it. The intellectual climate was simply too restricted by a suspicion of the unknown.
It wasn't until Leonardo of Pisa, also known as Fibonacci, in the early 13th century, that a Christian finally made a significant advance in the science.
Exactly. Prior to that, 16th century mathematics was built almost entirely upon non-Christian sources. It is a quiet reminder of how entire epochs of civilization can blind themselves to the very tools needed to understand the universe.
And those tools, those mathematical patterns, dictate the very reality of the air you are breathing right now. The book uses brilliant, stark analogies of proportion to prove that Aristotelian logic completely fails us because it ignores the fundamental questions of how much and in what proportion. Think about the exact laws of chemical proportions. Carbon monoxide, a specific rigid arrangement of carbon and oxygen, will kill you if you breathe it in.
It will.
But simply add one more atom of oxygen to that invisible architecture to make carbon dioxide. And while too much might give you a headache, it is absolutely necessary to dilute the oxygen in the atmosphere so you can survive. Arsenic, depending entirely on its proportional dose, can deal out either health or death. It is all about the pattern.
What's fascinating here is how this applies even beyond chemistry. Even in political economy, the law of diminishing returns dictates the exact conditions for the maximum efficiency of capital. Aristotelian logic deals in high abstractions, categorizing things as inherently good or bad, but it completely misses the mathematical guardianship of how much and what pattern.
There is a shift here that requires us to rethink everything we just talked about regarding how we experience the physical world. This realization entirely destroys our old, comforting notions of reality, specifically what is called simple location. Let's ground this. Under the old Newtonian physics, we believed that a stone had an independent individuality. Think of Newtonian physics like dropping a pin on a digital map.
Right, that pin is static.
Static, isolated, and completely independent. We believe you could describe that stone completely on its own, existing solely in the present moment, without any reference to its past, its future, or the rest of the universe. It was simply located there.
But modern wave theory physics dissolves this completely. Modern physics dictates that physical things, stars, planets, molecules, the very cells in your body, are not isolated objects at all. They are modifications of conditions within space-time. Instead of a pin on a map, think of dropping a stone into a still pond. The object isn't just the stone, it is the entire cascading ripple effect interacting with the water around it.
They are a streaming wave of influence.
Yes, superposed throughout the entire universe. A thing is not where it sits, a thing is what it does, and what it does streams infinitely outward. We have abandoned the delusion of simple location and returned, inevitably, to Plato's receptacle, to a universe of pure, flowing interconnectedness.
Which brings us to a statement in this argument that forces you to just stop and close your eyes for a moment. It quietly declares that the certainties of science are a delusion. They are hedged around with unexplored limitations. We tend to think of scientific observation as the ultimate, impartial truth. But we are asked here to look closer at the meeting of two orders of experience. The conceptual order, which is the system of ideas we inherit, and the observational order, which is what we directly discriminate with our senses.
It is a massive claim.
So what does this all mean? If observation distorts facts, as this premise suggests, how are we supposed to trust anything we see or measure? How can the very act of observing something make it less true?
It is a disorienting thought, but it comes down to how our minds process overwhelming information. We assume observation is impartial, but it inherently isn't. Observational discrimination actually distorts the facts. It selects, it discards, and it rearranges what is left into a subjective order of prominence. To make this beautifully clear, there is a metaphor here that you can step into right now. Imagine the myth of Adam and Eve on their very first day of life, standing in the garden, looking up at the sky at noon.
A brilliant, flooded blue sky.
Exactly. The direct, undeniable fact of their observation is the sun, as the sole origin of light, surrounded by the bare, empty heavens. To their eyes, that is the absolute truth.
But that excess of light is actually deceiving them. The immense brightness of the noon sky actively conceals the stars that are always there, waiting quietly behind the blue. Our observation inherently selects the loudest, brightest facts, the sun, and discards the subtle ones, the distant stars. It creates a subjective, delusive completeness. It is only when the sun sets and the overwhelming certainty of the day fades that creation widens to their view.
It's a terrifying thought. If the physical universe isn't a collection of solid, predictable objects, but this fragile, flowing web of interconnected waves, and if our own senses inherently distort the truth to give us a false sense of certainty, our old frameworks for finding meaning suddenly look obsolete. It forces us to ask, if science can't give us absolute certainty, where does the human spirit look for a compass?
This brings us to a massive shift occurring in the religious landscape, explored in a chapter titled The New Reformation. We are asked to witness a slow-moving tectonic contrast occurring in our world. On one side, we see the steady decay of Protestant institutional dogmas. The rigid forms, the strict divisions, the older dogmas derived from 300 years ago, they are crumbling. They no longer direct the patterns of life.
They are fading away.
But on the other side of that contrast is the enduring, astonishing triumph of the religious spirit itself, quietly surviving the collapse of its own institutions.
And this triumph isn't anchored in ancient, dusty history, but in an event contemporaneous with the writing of this book, an event of profound moral authority. In India, a swirling mass of violence and strife between rulers and people, between races and religions, threatened to overwhelm hundreds of millions of lives. Yet those forces of brute physical compulsion were momentarily halted by two men, Mahatma Gandhi and Lord Irwin, the Viceroy of India.
They achieved this not through the barrel of a gun, not through Newtonian force, but through the moral authority of divine persuasion.
Yes. It was a lived example of the religious motive responding to a persuasive rather than coercive reality. It proved that this gentle spirit holds an immense, almost gravitational power over the consciences of humanity.
But here is where I have to pause. Even as this pure religious spirit survives through persuasion, the text offers a surprisingly staunch defense of systematic theology. It sounds counterintuitive. Why defend systematic theology if the rigid dogmas are the very things that are decaying? There has been a tendency among liberal clergy to throw away systematic thought entirely, to rely purely on vague good feelings and moral intuitions.
Because a civilized religion actually requires systematic theology to guard itself against wild, unchecked superstition. History has authority, and an attack upon the systematic rationalization of our deepest intuitions is viewed here as treason to civilization. Without a coherent framework to interpret the ultimate mystery of the universe, religious feeling devolves to chaotic, sometimes dangerous, emotionalism. We need the intellect to structure the intuition.
To build that framework, these pages meticulously analyze three culminating phases of religion, an evolution of thought that stretches over 1,200 years. The first of these phases takes us back to Plato's intellectual discovery toward the end of his life. Plato realized, and this is perhaps one of the greatest intellectual discoveries in the history of religion, that the divine element in the world is a persuasive agency, not a coercive one. God is not a supreme, thunder-wielding force of compulsion, disposing of a completely derivative world by fiat. The divine operates through the gentle, persistent persuasion of ideals.
The second phase moves from that intellectual theory to a supreme moral revelation in act, the life of Christ. The focus here is not on the tangled reconstructions of historical facts, but on the elements that have consistently evoked a response from the best in human nature. The lowly man, the bare manger, the homelessness, the agony, and the ultimate authority of peace, love, and sympathy.
This was the moment where Plato's theory of divine persuasion was proven in real, agonizing, victorious life. The ideals were no longer just abstract mathematical harmonies, they were lived, physical reality.
Precisely. And the third phase brings us to the early Christian theologians of Alexandria and Antioch. Their contribution to world thought is vastly underestimated. They made a profound metaphysical discovery, the concept of direct immanence.
Let's break that down. Instead of picturing a God who sits on a cloud, far away and entirely separate from the universe, which philosophers call transcendence, they realized the divine is actually woven directly into the fabric of the world itself. They realized that God is actually within the world and within Christ.
This was a massive improvement upon Plato, who, for all his genius, could only conceive of the world as a secondary image or imitation of the divine. Plato left a gap between the eternal God and the transient world. The early Christian theologians bridged that gap with the doctrine of mutual immanence, demanding that the world requires its union with God and God requires union with the world.
But, and this is where the tragedy of history unfolds in this analysis, they made a fatal metaphysical flaw. While they grasped immanence, they still exempted God from all the metaphysical categories of the temporal world. They sublimated the concept of God back into an absolute omnipotent despot, much like an early Egyptian or Mesopotamian king.
They created an entity internally complete, requiring no relations to anything beyond himself. By doing this, they recreated a massive, unbridgeable gulf between God and the world. If God is completely exempt from the changing, perishing reality of our lives, it becomes nearly impossible to know what is happening on the further side of that gulf.
Which leads to a highly provocative suggestion for how Protestant theology might evolve to finally grasp the true, interconnected unity of the universe. And we must be clear, this is offered not as an endorsement of any particular political or religious sect, but as an impartial philosophical observation on the emotional patterns that sustain human civilization. The suggestion is this: to replace the final book of the authoritative religious literature, the Book of Revelation, which is viewed here as retaining barbaric, coercive elements of thunder, plague, and destruction, with something akin to Thucydides' imaginative account of the speech of Pericles to the Athenians.
The underlying premise of that suggestion is to shift the religious focus entirely away from apocalyptic dominance. By moving away from visions of coercive destruction, theology could pivot toward a shared, persuasive ideal of civilization, where the highest religious spirit becomes the common, rational basis for the unity of humanity. It is about aligning our deepest spiritual texts with the reality of a persuasive rather than a coercive universe.
It is a staggering thought, asking us to gently reevaluate the very texts that shape our emotional patterns. But the book doesn't stop at theology. We are moved forward to challenge the very foundation of how we experience reality itself. We arrive at chapter 11, a direct challenge to the great philosophers of the modern era, Descartes, Locke, and Hume.
These thinkers built their philosophies by relying only on elements of their experience that were clear and distinct. They assumed that the most fundamental factors of reality would naturally lend themselves to crisp, clear intellectual discrimination. But the text argues this is entirely mistaken.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They misunderstood the fundamental structure of experience, specifically the subject-object relationship. For centuries, philosophers have identified the subject-object relation merely as the knower and the known, as if you, the subject, are simply a passive recipient of cold data about an object.
But the contention here is that mere knowledge is a high abstraction. Conscious discrimination is just a tiny, flickering variable. The true foundational basis of our experience with the world is not analytical knowledge. It is deeply, profoundly emotional.
To express this deeply emotional interaction, the text borrows a term from the Quakers, the word concern. When you, the subject, experience an object, you have a concern for it. You don't just passively know it. You draw an effective tone and emotion from that object and direct it back toward it. There is a formal term introduced for this mode of activity prehensions.
Think of apprehension not as a physical grasping, but as an emotional grasping. Apprehension involves three factors. First, there is you, the subject experiencing. Second, there is the datum, the object whose relevance is provoking your experience. And third, there is the subjective form, which is the affective tone, the exact emotional resonance that determines how that object affects you.
This concept completely dismantles what is called the sensationalist doctrine, the widely held belief that all perception is mediated solely by our bodily sense organs, and that we only perceive bare, sterile sensations in the immediate present. There is a wonderfully stark example given. Imagine gazing at a patch of red.
Yes, just a simple patch of color.
If you look at that bare sensation of red purely as an object of your present sight, it tells you absolutely nothing. It is silent about the past. It is silent about the future. It doesn't tell you how it originated or when it will vanish. If our experience was just clear and distinct sensory data, we would be entirely lost in a meaningless, isolated present.
The truth is, our conscious sensory knowledge is just a tiny, brightly lit addition resting upon a massive, dark, emotional interaction with the entire universe.
And the most compelling, undeniable proof against the idea that we only experience the world through bare sense perception is something so intimate, so quiet, you barely notice it. It is your knowledge of your own immediate past. We aren't talking about your memory of what you did yesterday or an hour ago. We are talking about the fraction of a second that just passed, the period of time lying between a tenth of a second and half a second ago.
Think about when you put down a heavy coffee mug. For a split second after you let go, your hand still feels the phantom weight of it. That tiny fraction of a second is completely gone. It has perished. And yet, it is profoundly heavily here. You are continuous with it. It is your indubitable self, forming the absolute foundation of your present existence.
You are prolonging its emotional tone. You are taking its data and deflecting it toward your new purposes in the present. And you are doing all of this without any sensory medium intervening. You do not see or touch the you of a quarter second ago. You inherit it invisibly, emotionally, and intimately.
This raises an important question. If our personal identity, the sheer undeniable fact of our existence in this exact moment, is entirely bound to the invisible, non-sensory inheritance of our immediate past from just a fraction of a second ago, how much of our supposedly clear, rational modern science is secretly being dictated by the invisible, non-sensory inheritance of our ancestors' unconscious metaphysics, meaning that?
Listen closely. Right now, as you hear the tone of my voice, you are stepping into a quiet, meticulously constructed landscape of thought.
We are taking a gentle, methodical journey into the book Adventures of Ideas by Alfred Whitehead.
And the mission before us is to carefully unravel the dense philosophical tapestry of this book. We're unpacking its intricate, almost delicate thoughts on time, the mind, nature, and existence itself.
We are going to examine every nuance of Whitehead's arguments, really letting the concepts breathe and unfold at their own pace.
This is an ongoing, continuous exploration of a vast intellectual terrain, and we want you to just settle in as we map this landscape together, step by step, without the pressure of a ticking clock.
So to start mapping this terrain, there's a foundational concept here about how the immediate past actually survives within the present.
Right.
Whitehead gives this incredibly vivid illustration. He asks us to picture a reasonably rapid speaker enunciating the phrase United States.
It is a brilliant starting point. He points out that when the speaker reaches that second word, states, the first word of the phrase, united, is already physically in the immediate past.
Yes, it is technically gone.
Exactly. But the speaker is naturally carried from United to States, and the two words conjointly live in the present moment. The past word actively energizes and claims its existence as a living issue in the present experience of the speaker.
But wait, wouldn't a philosopher like David Hume just call that a habit? Hume is famous for his association of ideas.
Hmm.
He would probably argue that we just have a deep familiarity or a mental habit of associating the sound united with the sound states. Like, we hear one, we automatically expect the other.
That is exactly the trap Hume falls into, and Whitehead anticipates it perfectly. Hume's theory falls remarkably short because it relies entirely on prior custom.
Right, it relies on us having heard it before.
Precisely. So to counter this, Whitehead introduces an alternate example. Yeah. Imagine the speaker is saying the phrase United Fruit Company.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here. A person might say United States every single day, so there is a clear habit there.
Yeah.
But maybe they have never once in their life heard of the United Fruit Company.
Suppose they invented the phrase United Fruit Company right on the spot. That means they have absolutely zero prior association or custom to rely on.
So there's no habit at all.
None. Yet, the intention formed during the word united intuitively drives their physical body to eventually say the word company. There's no vestige of historical association to help them along.
That is fascinating. So if there is no habit to fall back on, what is pushing them forward?
The past occasion itself. It actively carries an unfulfilled intention right into the present.
I see.
The final occasion of the speaker's experience, which drives the physical body to utter the sound company, is only explicable because the speaker is still actively concerned with the earlier occasions.
So the past isn't just a dead static memory sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere.
No, not at all. It lives inside the present, actively pushing it forward toward a specific completion. This is a direct, intuitive observation of the past physically energizing the present.
If the past is physically pushing into the present, what does this mean for our own emotions? If I think about my own sense of self, it feels continuous.
Which brings us to what Whitehead calls the doctrine of confirmation of feeling. I have to be honest, that sounds a bit dense.
It sounds intimidating, sure, but it is really just about the delicate balance between the absolute individuality of a specific moment and the overarching continuity of nature.
Okay, how so?
Think about the analogy of an angry man. How does a man know he was angry a quarter of a second ago?
I mean, if someone cuts me off in traffic and I get road rage, I know I was angry a second ago because I just remember it. It feels like a simple trick of memory.
It is entirely natural to assume we just remember our feelings, but Whitehead inquires into this very curious fact of memory and argues it goes much deeper than just a mental snapshot.
Deeper how?
The first phase of any new moment is a confirmation of feelings. The exact subjective form of anger, as it was enjoyed by the past occasion, the literal energetic feeling of that road rage is transferred continuously to the new occasion.
So the anger physically flows into the new moment. It's not just a memory, it's an inheritance.
Yes, exactly. This continuity of subjective form is the initial sympathy the present moment has for the past moment. And this gently corrects Hume's doctrine of custom.
Because Hume relied on custom and the liveliness of impressions to explain why one moment follows another.
Right. But by adding this vital concept of the immanence of the past flowing directly into the future, we discover the true basis for memory, personal identity, and even causation.
So we aren't just remembering we were angry.
We are physically inheriting the energetic feeling of that anger from a fraction of a second ago. The past is quite literally imminent in the future.
I hear what he's saying about human experience, but this is where I get a little skeptical. Whitehead makes this profound argument that human experience cannot simply be placed outside of nature. If humanity is part of the universe, he says the traits of human consciousness must have direct, observable parallels in the world of physics. He actually mentions electrons, protons, photons, and wave motion.
He does.
How does he justify making that massive leap from a guy experiencing road rage to the behavior of an electron?
It is a massive leap, I agree, but it is central to his entire philosophy. Physical science already recognizes qualitative differences in how occasions entertain their energy. Whitehead specifically highlights the Poynting flux of energy, drawing on the foundational work of Clerk Maxwell and Sir J.J. Thomson.
Okay, pause. Poynting flux of energy is some heavy jargon. Can we get a plain English translation of that?
Absolutely. In electrodynamics, energy doesn't just teleport randomly from point A to point B. It has recognizable, traceable paths through time and space.
Like water in a pipe.
Exactly. Think of it like water flowing through a specific network of pipes. Energy flows continuously from one particular occasion to another in a definite direction with a measurable quantitative flow. That directed flow is the Poynting flux.
And the connection to human psychology is what, exactly?
That physical flux of energy in science is the exact counterpart to the conformal inheritance of subjective feeling in human psychology.
The physical flux of a photon matches our psychological inheritance of an emotion.
Yes.
Wait, so are you saying Whitehead believes a photon has feelings or purpose? Because that sounds like science fiction.
Not feelings in the human sense of conscious emotion, no. But he is raising a critical point about how we view the universe. The notion of physical energy, which is at the base of all physics, must actually be conceived as an abstraction.
An abstraction of what?
An abstraction of the complex, emotional, and purposeful energy that inherently drives all existence. The electrons transmitting energy through space are fundamentally doing the exact same thing your mind does when it carries a thought or purpose from one microsecond to the next.
So when Whitehead says physical science is an abstraction, it isn't an insult.
Not at all. It's a recognition that rational thought must look at the more concrete, purposeful fact from which that physical abstraction is derived.
That reframes everything. It's all so intimately connected. But if absolutely everything in the universe is just a flux of energy and occasions, we have to address the inescapable fact of personal unity.
Right.
How do you remain you amidst this sheer flowing chaos of life from birth to death? If I'm just a series of microseconds inheriting energy, what is holding me together?
That is the core metaphysical puzzle. To answer it, Whitehead adapts a brilliant concept from Plato's Timaeus. He describes what he calls the receptacle, or the locus.
What exactly is a receptacle in this context?
You can think of it as a formless, invisible, all-receptive matrix. It is the foster mother of our becoming. Imagine a catcher's mitt that catches and holds all the transitions of a single person's life.
A catcher's mitt holding on to everything we experience.
Yes, and because this receptacle must receive all manner of different experiences into its own unity, joy, sorrow, boredom, pain, it must itself be bare of all forms. It is shaped only by two things: the compulsion of its own past and the persuasion of its imminent ideals.
So our consciousness of self-identity isn't some magical, separate, ghostly entity floating around inside our skulls.
Exactly. It is just a special, highly ordered strand within the general, universe-wide vector structure of nature.
Vector structure, like a web of directional arrows.
Precisely. Imagine a massive, infinite web of arrows, where every arrow represents the direction and force of energy moving from the past to the future.
Okay, I can picture that.
We are a focused locus within that whole web, marked out by our own peculiar strand of arrows, but otherwise exhibiting the exact same general principles that guide the constitution of the entire universe.
So where does the physical body fit into this invisible web? Because my thoughts feel very linear, but my body feels like it's throwing a million different signals at me all at once.
That is a fascinating complication. Pure human experience usually follows a strict one-dimensional serial order. You have one thought, then the next thought, then the next, a linear timeline.
Right.
But the human body completely shatters this strict one-dimensional order.
It really does. The body introduces many-dimensional spatial realities right into the brain. We're talking about sensitive nerves, shifts in blood chemistry, visceral functionings from our digestive organs.
That's a lot of input.
If I skip lunch, my plummeting blood sugar spatially breaks in upon my linear thoughts, and suddenly I'm irritated. Being hangry is a perfect example of how these bodily processes break in upon the dominant line of mental inheritance. Emotions, hopes, and fears arise directly from bodily functionings. Body and soul are completely, inextricably fused together.
Which brings us to Whitehead's entirely unique defense of dualism. If you studied philosophy, you know the old vicious dualism of René Descartes.
Right, the mind-body split.
Descartes argued for a strict, impenetrable separation between mind and matter, as if they are totally incompatible substances that somehow awkwardly interact. Whitehead does not support that old revolt.
He redefines it.
Entirely. He argues that dualism exists perfectly within every single moment of actuality.
So the universe is dual because absolutely everything in it is both physical and mental at the exact same time.
Yes. It is both transient and eternal. It is both unified and multiplied. You cannot separate the physical inheritance of your nerves and your blood chemistry from the mental reaction that drives your self-completion.
They are two sides of the same coin.
Whenever a vicious dualism appears in philosophy, it's simply because someone mistook an abstraction for a final concrete fact. Throughout the universe, there reigns a union of opposites.
So if our bodies are this complex fusion of mind and matter, how does that unified body actually travel through time? Because time, as Whitehead argues, isn't what we usually think it is.
He gives a very strong warning to the reader against what he calls the literary habit. We have this habit of thinking of time in massive time spans, like centuries, decades, or years. We look at history as a massive fable.
Which makes sense for telling stories, but maybe not for physics.
Exactly. This literary habit enfeebles our intuition. If you want to truly observe time and how the past, present, and future interact, you must confine your observation to fractions of a second.
And in those tiny fractions of a second, we see how the future is already imminent in the present. The present moment constantly swings from reenaction of the past to an anticipation of the future. Now, obviously, the future doesn't exist yet as actual, finalized physical entities.
Right. Whitehead points out that there are no actual occasions in the future exercising efficient causation on us now.
Okay, let's define efficient causation for a moment. In philosophy, that's just a fancy way of saying one thing physically bumping into and causing another, right? Like a cue ball hitting an 8-ball.
That is the perfect analogy. Because the future hasn't happened yet, it can't act like a cue ball and physically bump into us today. But the future does exist in the present as an objective necessity.
Yeah, so.
It exists as a set of conditions inherently laid down by the present moment. Think of it as a creative urge. The self-enjoyment of an occasion begins by enjoying the past that is alive within it, and it ends by enjoying itself as it anticipates being alive in the future.
So the present essentially dictates the necessary conditions that the future must conform to. But wait, if the past determines the present, and the present lays down the strict conditions for the future, where is the freedom? Where is the wiggle room in this universe? If everything is just a continuous inheritance, aren't we just completely determined robots?
That is the ultimate question, and Whitehead answers it beautifully through the concept of contemporary events. This is a crucial metaphysical distinction. By definition, contemporary events are events that happen at the exact same time.
So two things happening simultaneously.
Yes, and because they happen simultaneously, they are causally independent of each other. Neither belongs to the past of the other, so neither can act like that cue ball and exert direct efficient causation on the other.
I see.
This vast causal independence provides the elbow room of the universe.
It's the literal physical foundation for freedom. It prevents complete mutual determination. The novelties that face the contemporary world are solved in total isolation by the contemporary occasions themselves.
There is complete contemporary freedom. You and your contemporary environment originate from a common past, but your immediate activity of self-creation in this very microsecond is completely separate and private.
As we grasp that freedom, we then need to understand how these highly independent, self-creating occasions actually group together to form the macro world we see around us.
Whitehead defines a nexus, spelled Nexus, simply as a group of occasions sharing mutual immanence. They are connected. He also defines contiguity, which is when occasions form an unbroken thread, either temporally, where one immediately follows another, or spatially.
But the analysis gets much more specific when defining what constitutes a society. When he says society, I assume he isn't talking about a cultural group of humans hanging out in a city.
No, a metaphysical society.
Right.
A society is a specific type of nexus that is self-sustaining. It shares a common element of form, a defining characteristic, and it reproduces that exact character genetically in its members.
Meaning the members are alike because their common character imposes conditions on new members to maintain that likeness. And by this strict metaphysical definition, what we call a person is technically just a one-dimensional, continuous, serial society of occasions.
A temporal thread.
Exactly. A temporal thread of contiguous occasions, exactly like what Descartes meant by a thinking substance. But a human being is much more than just a person. We are a complex living body, a wider society that coordinates a vast number of spatial and temporal occasions.
The metaphors he uses to compare different forms of life here are really striking. He explains why a tree, for instance, is considered a democracy.
Wait, what does politics have to do with a plant? How is a tree a democracy?
A tree is absolutely a living society, but it completely lacks a single dominant personal society dictating its actions. Its living occasions are diffused. A leaf can survive for a while if you cut off a branch, because the life force is spread out democratically among all its cellular societies.
Ah, I see. Contrast that democracy of the tree with a dog or a human being. We are living bodies entirely ruled by a dominant personal society.
The monarchy of the mind.
Yes, this dominant society, our conscious mind, or what Plato might call the soul, coordinates all the low-grade occasions like our cells and our nerves, turning their basic functioning into high-grade mentality. Life is the coordination of mental spontaneities toward a common objective. The monarchy of the mind, if you will, rules the society of the body.
Which naturally leads us to question how this dominant monarch, our conscious mind, actually perceives the world. This is where Whitehead introduces the vital contrast between appearance and reality.
He unpacks this contrast by walking us through the exact process of how an experience forms, right?
He does. The initial phase of any single experience is pure reality.
Pure reality. What does that consist of?
It is the objective, raw, unedited content inherited directly from the actual past. There is nothing there but the real, concrete agency of the past pushing into the present.
Okay, so then what happens? How does that raw reality become the world I see around me?
Then comes the mind's intermediate phase. Whitehead eloquently calls this the ferment of valuation. This is where the mind introduces concepts, qualitative feelings, and ideal possibilities. The mind overlays the raw reality with these new conceptual prehensions.
Prehensions. I've seen that word a lot in his work. If we translate that to plain English, is it basically the mind's way of grasping or including something into its own experience?
That is an excellent way to frame it. The mind grasps these ideals and values. Finally, the fusion of these ideal mental concepts with the actual raw reality creates what Whitehead terms appearance.
Appearance is the world transformed by the mental pole.
Exactly, the world in the guise of a subject matter for our enjoyment.
To borrow a phrase he uses, appearance is the light that never was on sea or land. It's the fusion of the ideal with the actual. Now, here's the ultimate metaphysical trap that he warns about. Inorganic bodies, like a rock or empty space, don't really have appearance because they don't introduce novel mental valuations.
Right, they just exist.
But higher animals, living on the surface of the earth, possess highly coordinated consciousness. Because of this, we live almost entirely in the realm of appearance.
This distinct, clear appearance is so loud, so vivid, and so dominant in our consciousness that it completely masks the vague, massive reality of our true origins. Appearance sheds the note of derivation. It feels like the whole world.
It's all we see.
And what's fascinating here is that this mask, this vivid appearance, is exactly what has led philosophers for thousands of years to falsely separate mind from nature. They look at the clear appearance, assume the mind is a totally separate entity from the physical world, and completely forget the raw reality that actually birthed it.
Consider how everything you are experiencing right at this very second, the subtle sounds you are hearing, the light in the room you were sitting in, the physical sensation of the air around you, is merely a conscious appearance. It is a delicate, complex tapestry that your mind has actively, seamlessly woven from the raw, unpolished reality of just a fraction of a second ago.
You are continuously creating this appearance out of the energetic inheritance of the immediate past, drawing from the deep receptacle of existence.
The boundary between the physical and the mental dissolves completely when you realize that every thought, every feeling is an echo of the physical flux of the universe itself, carrying its momentum forward, constantly anticipating the immediate future that is already unfolding in the very structure of your ongoing experience.
It makes you wonder, if our reality is just a continuous inheritance of the immediate past, what happens when we intentionally change the ideals we feed into our receptacle during that ferment evaluation?
If tomorrow's physical reality is shaped by today's mental overlays, perhaps we aren't just observing the universe in a passive state. Perhaps, fraction of a second by fraction of a second, as we choose how to value our experiences, we are the ones literally writing its physical code, shaping the very structure of what comes next as we turn the page to examine how these structures manifest in.
As we settle quietly back into the landscape of the book, I'd like to ask you to take just a moment to ground yourself right where you are. If you were listening to this, softly look around the room or the environment you're currently in.
Just take it in.
Notice how effortlessly your brain takes what is in reality this chaotic storm of molecules, light waves, historical contexts, and neatly packages it into solid, understandable objects.
Right. It's an incredible trick the mind plays.
You perceive a chair, you perceive a window, you do not see the swirling atomic dance or the nearly infinite chain of causes that actually manufactured and placed those items right there in front of you.
You just see the appearance of the room.
Exactly, you just see the appearance. And our quiet intention here is to slowly unravel this profound fusion of appearance and reality. We are going to explore the hidden mechanics of how everything is connected, the limitations of the words we use every single day, and eventually a rather unsettling perspective on the nature of truth itself.
It's a journey. And that simple act of observing the room around you gets right to the heart of a paradox the book explores so beautifully.
It really does.
There is this common assumption that our high-level human mentality exists to add complex detail, to add subtlety to our experience of the universe.
Right. That because we have these advanced brains, we see more of the truth.
Exactly. But the author suggests the exact opposite is closer to reality. Mentality is primarily an agent of simplification.
Since an editor.
Yes, a ruthless editor.
Yeah.
What we call appearance. That neat, tidy room you're observing right now is a drastically simplified edition of reality.
Because if we didn't simplify it,
We would be paralyzed.
Yeah.
The raw, massive complexity of our derivations from the universe is just too overwhelming to process all at once. So animal experience and human experience alike performs this massive act of elimination.
there is an analogy used to describe this simplification that involves a symphony orchestra.
Oh, the orchestra analogy is perfect for this.
Right. When you sit in the audience and the music plays, you perceive the orchestra as a single, unified, loud entity.
You hear one massive wall of sound.
The loudness feels like it is a property of the whole group. But underneath that simplified appearance, the sound is actually a highly complex fusion of dozens of individual musicians.
Playing completely distinct instruments.
Exactly. The rosin on the bow of a violin, the breath moving through the brass of a trumpet, you are quietly experiencing the many as the one.
And a very similar dynamic happens with the concept of a regiment of soldiers. We often speak of the discipline of a regiment.
As if the regiment itself is a single entity that possesses that specific quality.
Right. But discipline exists within the composite group in a fundamentally different way than it exists within the individual soldiers.
It's the individual, momentary actions of each soldier that actually forge that discipline.
Exactly. And this phenomenon is termed transmutation.
Transmutations.
Yes. It is the mental operation where qualities shared by many individual actualities are transferred or fused into one dominating impression.
So we unconsciously project that transmuted impression onto the group, and we perceive it as a unified whole.
Which is a completely necessary mechanism for navigating reality. But we have to remember, it belongs entirely to the realm of appearance.
It certainly makes you reconsider the physical mechanism behind all of this. I mean, sense perception and the brain.
The physical hardware.
Right. The book points out that the decisive factor in how we perceive the world is simply the functioning of our own brain. And that brain is entirely conditioned by the state of our body.
And there's a phrase used there that I find really lingering.
Supremely indifferent.
That's the one. It describes the body as being supremely indifferent to the actual past history of the things it perceives.
That supreme indifference is just a structural part of our biology.
It is. Consider a beam of light entering your eye right now.
Okay.
That specific light could have originated from a distant nebula 1,000 light years away. It could have been traveling across the cold vacuum of space for millennia.
Just an ancient photon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Alternatively, that exact same light could be coming from a small electric lamp sitting 2 feet away on your desk.
Having just undergone a series of immediate local reflections.
Right, but to your body. The origin story of that light is completely irrelevant.
The eye doesn't care about the history.
It demands no certificate of character from the environment. All that registers is the precise way that light interacts with the eye, its geometry, and the localized bodily excitement it generates.
Which explains quite neatly why our senses are so incredibly vulnerable to illusion.
Oh, absolutely.
If all the body actually processes is the local excitement of the nerves, then it follows that a diet of certain drugs can produce sensory perceptions just as vividly as real external events.
Because the nerve excitement is identical.
Right. And we accept ordinary illusions constantly without a second thought. Think about an ordinary looking glass. A mirror.
We have them in almost every room we inhabit.
And it creates a wholly convincing illusion of depth in physical objects that are not actually there behind the wall. And we simply navigate around it. We accept the appearance.
But relying solely on these simplified, bare sense perceptions leads to what the book describes as a false metaphysics.
Because we trust the simplified version too much.
Exactly. Because our senses constantly present the contemporary world to us in these transmuted passive packages, the mirror, the chair, the wall. We fall into the habit of assuming these objects are merely passive recipients of qualities.
We begin to view the world as what the author calls a vacuous substratum. I want to pause on that term, actually. Vacuous substratum, because it can feel a bit dense.
It is a dense philosophical term.
If I am looking at a heavy wooden desk right now, it appears to be just dead matter. It's taking up space, but it seems completely empty of any inner reality or activity. Is that what is meant by vacuous?
Yes, precisely. Vacuous in this context means devoid of intrinsic worth, internal process, or self-enjoyment.
We wrongly conceive of the world as a dead, passive background that merely occupies space.
Right. We lose sight of the scientific and metaphysical reality that the contemporary world is throbbing with energetic processes.
The wood in that desk is a buzzing hive of atomic and subatomic activity.
Every actual occasion is a complex activity. But because our intellect performs this continuous act of elimination to make daily life manageable,
We mistake the simplified static appearance for the dynamic reality.
we mistake the map for the territory.
So if relying exclusively on our five senses traps us in this dead, vacuous view of the world, we have to look really closely at how we actually search for truth.
Which moves us directly into the method of philosophy.
There is a gentle but incredibly firm argument here that theory dictates method.
You cannot simply wander out and gather objective evidence from nowhere.
Right. The evidence you even notice or consider relevant in the first place is entirely dependent on the theory or the working hypothesis you are already holding.
The contrast between historical frameworks illustrates this beautifully. Take the theory of David Hume.
Okay, the empiricist view.
Right. If you adopt Hume's premise, the idea is that the only data we have are individual, disconnected impressions of sensation.
A patch of color here. A distinct sound there.
Exactly. If that is your starting theory, you will inevitably find zero evidence for the interconnectedness of things.
Because your framework inherently filters out connections.
Wow.
You've predefined reality as disconnected parts.
Yes. Alternatively, if you operate under a Cartesian view, dividing the universe rigidly into substantial souls on one side and material bodies on the other, you encounter a completely different limitation.
The mind-body split.
Right. Under that theory, the experiences of one isolated soul offer absolutely no evidence about the experiences of another soul, nor about the physical world itself.
The trap is circular. You cannot prove or disprove a theory using evidence that the theory itself has preemptively dismissed as irrelevant.
You're trapped in the house you built.
Which circles back to a very old purpose of philosophy, echoing all the way back to Socrates. The objective is to delve beneath the apparent clarity of common speech.
Words give us a false sense of comprehensive understanding.
They really do. There is a reference to Plato's dialogue, The Sophist, where he introduces the idea that not being is a form of being.
It's a striking phrase.
I have to push back gently on that, though. It sounds like a pure logical contradiction.
On the surface, it absolutely does.
How can the absence of something actually be a form of being?
It sounds contradictory only if we treat words as rigid, static containers. But think of it in terms of potential and the past.
Okay.
When an event is over, it no longer is in the immediate present. It has entered a state of not being.
The conversation we had 5 minutes ago is gone. It is not being.
Yet the fact that it happened continues to shape the present reality. We are speaking now based on what we said then. The absence or the pastness of the event is a real functional condition of the universe right now.
So it's not being has a tangible presence.
Exactly. That is a reality common speech just struggles to map.
And that struggle points to two rather significant errors in modern epistemology.
Our theories of how we know what we know.
Right. The first error is the quiet assumption that our only avenues of communication with the external world are the 5 specific sense organs.
The eyes, the ears, the nose.
The argument here is that the living organ of experience is not merely the eye or the ear, it is the entire living body.
The whole system.
The brain is continuous with the body, and the body is seamlessly continuous with the rest of nature. We are physically embedded in the universe. We are not isolated observers peering out through 5 tiny windows in a dark room.
We are part of the landscape we are observing. And the second error involves relying too heavily on conscious introspective analysis.
Looking inward to understand the mind.
Right. When we try to analyze our own experience, our consciousness automatically highlights the clear-cut, easily definable sensory data.
We notice the sharp visual image. We notice the distinct thought crossing our mind.
But in elevating those sharp details, introspection cloaks and hides the massive, vague, dim compulsions and physiological derivations of the body.
The subtle shifts in our gut, the baseline hum of our nervous system.
Yes. Those form the actual foundation of our experience. But conscious introspection ignores them because they aren't sharp or easily labeled.
So to understand the totality of experience, we cannot just filter out the ambiguous parts. There is a thought here that philosophy must account for the entirety of human states.
All of it.
It must hold space for experience when sleeping just as much as waking. Experience when anxious, and one carefree.
Experience in the dark and in the light.
Conscious introspection usually privileges the sober, waking, well-lit moments. We think that's when we are most in touch with reality.
But the dark, anxious, and sleeping moments are equally valid, crude evidence of reality. They are part of the total data set.
If the isolated five senses and conscious introspection are both prone to filtering out reality, we must look elsewhere for a true house of evidence.
We have to look at how humanity actually functions in the world.
The text points toward language, social institutions, and action. And more specifically, it highlights the profound power of literature.
Literature is fascinating in this context.
It is the space where humanity manages to express meanings that far exceed the boundaries of rigid grammar or isolated words.
There is a line quoted from the ancient Greek playwright Euripides that captures this perfectly.
Oh, the Zeus quote. Let me read that. It reads, "Zeus, whether thou art compulsion of nature or intelligence of mankind, to thee I prayed."
If we pause and just unpack that single sentence, the sheer density of concepts is remarkable.
It weaves together the idea of a divine order,
The strict mechanical necessity of physical nature, the compulsion of nature,
the abstract intelligence of humanity,
and the deeply emotional, persuasive act of prayer.
no collection of basic isolated sense data, no simple impression of a color or a sound could ever construct the interconnected reality of those ideas.
Literature manages to capture the energetic values of the world that basic perception completely misses.
However, even with literature, we eventually confront the inadequacy of language itself.
Words fail us.
A stable, unchanging vocabulary in philosophy is treated here as a complete myth.
We easily accept that disciplines like quantum physics or higher mathematics must invent new symbols and words to articulate new discoveries.
Right, nobody expects a physicist to just use everyday dictionary words to explain a quark.
Exactly. Philosophy requires the same flexibility. Relying purely on the everyday dictionary prevents us from explaining the deeper textures of reality.
There is a great anecdote mentioned involving two logicians, Joseph and Johnson.
Oh, yes.
Johnson utilized the single-word proposition in a treatise, and when Joseph analyzed the text, he discovered 20 distinct, separate meanings for how Johnson had unconsciously deployed that one single word.
20 different meanings for proposition.
Yeah.
It demonstrates perfectly how everyday language fractures when we attempt to describe the complex connectedness of things.
And connectedness really is the core issue here. We typically use the word relation to describe how things connect.
But there's a compelling argument that relation strips away reality.
It makes it too abstract.
Exactly. Consider the geographic reality of three cities. New York lies between Boston and Philadelphia. If we merely apply the abstract, universal concept of betweenness as a generic relation, we lose the actual truth of the situation.
Because betweenness could apply to 3 books on a shelf or 3 numbers in a sequence.
Right. But the fact that New York sits between those specific cities is a deeply complex historical, physical fact taking up space on the Earth. It involves geography, politics, human migration. It is a concrete reality, not an abstract floating concept.
Because these traditional words fail to hold the weight of reality, the book introduces a specialized vocabulary to articulate this living connectedness.
These terms require a bit of patience, but they offer a much more accurate lens.
Let's walk through them. The first is prehension.
Prehension. This describes the process of thoroughly understanding or taking in another entity, but crucially, without necessarily having conscious awareness of it.
It is how any moment of experience physically incorporates part of the universe into itself.
Let's apply that to the listener right now.
Okay. As you listen to this, your body is prehending the temperature of the room.
You are prehending the faint hum of an appliance in the background.
The pressure of the chair against your back. You aren't consciously focusing on those things. You are focused on our voices. But your body is physically grasping them. It is prehending them.
It is a perfect application. Now, when a prehension is positive, when the data of what is being experienced is actively preserved and woven into your new experience, that is termed a feeling.
But we should clarify, this is not a mechanical, sterile transfer of data.
No, not at all. Every feeling is wrapped in what is called a subjective form.
Subjective form.
This is the emotional clothing, the specific tone or character that colors the perception.
So you do not just prehend the temperature of the room, you prehend it with a subtle feeling of comfort, or perhaps a slight irritation if it's too cold.
The subjective form is the living emotion attached to the bare physical fact.
And all of these countless feelings, prehensions, and subjective forms are continuously blending together in real time.
The term used for this blending is concrescence.
Concrescence, originating from a Latin root meaning growing together.
It describes the ongoing complex process of many different entities and feelings merging to form a completely new, unified reality.
Your exact experience in this very current second is a concrescence. It is the growing together of your physical environment, your personal history, your current mood, and the sound of these words.
Recognizing that every moment is a concrescence leads to a rather quiet, contemplative question.
What happens to this present moment when it ends?
When events pass into the past, they perish. They pass from the immediate vibrancy of being into the not being of the past.
But as we discuss with Plato's sophists, they do not become nothing. When things perish, they achieve what is termed objective immortality.
Objective immortality.
It is a concept that completely reframes a passage of time for me. Perishing is not an absolute end. Rather, it is the initiation of becoming.
The past perishes, but it physically and emotionally echoes forward into the present.
It survives through physical causation. It survives through the persistence of memory and through our emotional confirmation to what has already occurred.
The past is a stubborn fact, and the exact way it perishes strictly dictates the materials that are available for the future to become.
Seeing the flow of time in this way requires us to re-examine a highly misunderstood concept: truth.
We generally assume truth is an absolute foundational property of the universe.
That reality is made of truths.
But there's a very careful distinction made here between truth and reality.
Reality simply is.
It is the ongoing process of concrescence. It cannot be categorized as true or false. It is just the universe functioning.
The universe isn't true or false, it's just there.
Truth, however, is a quality that belongs strictly to appearance. Truth is defined merely as the confirmation of appearance to reality.
It is a relationship between how things seem and how things actually are.
And because truth is just a relationship of appearance, it can be deeply deceptive.
There are examples given of the wrong species of truth.
Consider a portrait painting, one that is so hyper-realistic, so perfectly faithful to the geometric details of a face,
That it successfully deceives the eye into believing it is a real human.
its very truthfulness to the geometry is what makes it a deception.
Or consider a mirror reflection. It is flawlessly truthful to the dimensions of the room, yet it is entirely an optical illusion. There is no room behind the glass.
Even the smile of a hypocrite is deceptive. Despite the physical muscle movements of the smile being a true, factual occurrence on their face.
The facts are true, but the reality is a lie.
The complications of truth become even more pronounced when we examine partial truths. To possess only a partial truth is to actively distort one's understanding of the universe.
There is an analogy regarding a hypothetical society that only possesses numbers to count up to 10.
Because their system artificially stops at 10, they're forced to enormously exaggerate the importance and frequency of small numbers.
They possess a partial truth about quantity. Small numbers exist, that's true, but it completely distorts their broader reality because they lack the framework to comprehend millions.
And we often do the exact same thing with the complexities of the cosmos.
It is a dynamic that applies even to the most rigorous levels of science. We instinctively assume that highly precise instruments are always the best path to truth.
The closer we look, the more true it is.
Right. But there is an argument, referencing the mathematician Henri Poincaré, that premature instruments of precision can actually stall scientific progress.
If Isaac Newton had possessed highly advanced modern instruments
And became bogged down by the minor, highly precise irregularities in Kepler's laws of planetary motion,
he might have been completely distracted by those tiny truths.
he might never have stepped back far enough to conceptualize the massive, sweeping law of gravitation. Minor truths can effortlessly beget major errors.
It is not unlike wearing a smartwatch and becoming so hyper-focused on the precise minor truth of your daily step count
That you completely lose sight of the broader reality of your actual physical and mental well-being.
This is why the concept of a proposition is given such weight in the text.
A proposition is defined here not as a sterile sentence on a page, but as an abstract possibility, a suggestion, a lure for feeling.
A proposition always carries an emotional incitement. It invites you to believe it, doubt it, mock it, or embrace it.
And this leads to what might be the most challenging claim we are looking at today. It is more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true.
I know.
I have to sit with that for a second. It is more important to be interesting than to be true.
It's provocative.
On the surface, that sounds like a philosophical defense of falsehood or even delusion.
It is so easy to misinterpret it that way.
Eh.
But it is not a defense of falsehood. It is an observation about the actual mechanics of reality.
How so?
The energy and the developmental importance of a proposition lie entirely in its emotional lure, in its interest.
Okay.
A perfectly true but completely barren and boring statement has absolutely no power to initiate a new concrescence.
It can't change how things grow together?
It cannot change your feelings, and it cannot drive the universe forward. A proposition's actual power is its ability to introduce a new subjective form, to make you feel something new.
Of course, a true proposition is generally more successful in long-term action, and truth has its own quiet, contemplative interest.
Certainly. But the raw, vital importance of any idea is whether it captures your interest. If it lacks that emotional lure, it is simply a dead end in the created advance of nature.
So as you continue to sit quietly in your environment, observing the simplified appearances around you, and recognizing that your current reality is a continuous, deeply connected concrescence of feelings, there is a thought here worth turning over in your mind. When you consider the ideas, the media, and the propositions you prehend and interact with every single day, are you merely collecting sterile, minor facts simply because they hold the wrong species of truth? Or are you actively engaging with ideas that possess the vital emotional interest required to actually transform your reality? Settle into a quiet space with us right now and just let your mind open to an expansive intellectual journey. Today, our mission is to unpack the delicate, really invisible forces that actually shape our reality and drive human civilization forward. We're continuing our steady journey through Alfred North Whitehead's profoundly important book, Adventures of Ideas.
It's such a fascinating text.
It really is. It doesn't just ask us what we know. It asks us to look intimately at how we know it. And I want to start with a concept that seems incredibly simple on the surface, but Whitehead uses it to completely flip our perspective. That concept is truth. When most of us think of truth, we just think of a cold collection of facts, right?
Like a list of data points.
Exactly. But the book defines truth as something much more fragile. It's described as the delicate relationship between appearance and reality. Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. How exactly does Whitehead separate what appears to us from what is actually real?
That distinction is really the perfect key to unlocking this entire book. To truly grasp that delicate relationship between appearance and reality, we have to slow down and look at the bare mechanics of how we perceive anything at all. In the book, Whitehead talks about the raw sensory data we take in.
The sensa?
Yes, the sensa. But instead of getting bogged down in the academic terminology, let's just think of this as the echoes of the past physically hitting us in the present moment. He uses a brilliant, vivid example that completely changed how I think about this. It's the example of a speechless infant.
Oh, right, the infant and the mother. This part was fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's so powerful. Think about a baby that hasn't learned a single word yet. Long before that child develops any intellectual capacity, any logic, or any framework to process the world, it intuitively and directly feels its mother's mood.
It just absorbs it.
Exactly. If the mother is cheerful, or if she is deeply depressed, the infant perceives that. But the infant isn't making a complex psychological deduction. It isn't observing her frown and thinking, she must be sad. The infant receives the mother's emotional state as a profound, immediate reality. It feels the mood with the exact same affective tone. The reality of the mother's emotion becomes the appearance in the child's mind, directly and physically.
I love that example because you can apply it to your own life right now. Think about walking into a room right after two people have been arguing. You don't need facts or words, you just feel the tension. You're experiencing an immediate emotional truth before your brain even has a chance to catch up.
You feel the physical weight of the past moment.
Yeah, and it makes you realize how much of our perception is just a direct inheritance from the immediate past, and that naturally brings up what the book calls a biological type of truth, right? How our bodies naturally function to show us the world.
Yes, and this is where truth really becomes a survival mechanism. A healthy organism naturally reacts to its environment and produces internal appearances that are proper to its specific species. It's a fundamental fact of nature.
So it's just normal functioning.
Precisely.
Yeah.
When you're walking through the woods, the truth of that moment is simply that you are perceiving what a well-conditioned human being should perceive under those exact physical circumstances governed by the laws of nature. Your body is translating the reality of the forest into the appearance of trees, sounds, and smells so you can successfully navigate it.
Okay, but here's where my mind was completely blown by the book. It's the time gap between reality and appearance. Whitehead talks about looking up at the Milky Way on a dark, moonless night. When you look up, what you see shining above you is your present appearance. It is happening to you right now.
Right.
But the reality that created that image, that is a flex of light energy that traveled through the utmost depths of space and illimitable time.
It is a staggering thought when you really sit with it.
It really is. I mean, those stars you're looking at, they might have burned out and died millions of years ago. The reality of that star is long gone. Yet, your present appearance, your truth in that moment, is completely tied to a deeply remote, dead past. The gap between what is real and what appears to be real can be millions of light years wide.
And that massive gap raises a very difficult question. If reality and appearance can be so detached, how do we bridge the gap in our everyday human lives? This is where Whitehead introduces a vaguer but incredibly powerful concept called symbolic truth.
Symbolic truth.
Yeah. With symbolic truth, there isn't necessarily a direct physical cause and effect relationship between the appearance and the reality.
Yeah.
Instead, a specific culture or group of people creates the connection.
Can you give an example of that? Are we talking about things like language?
Language is the most obvious one, yes. The word tree has no physical connection to an actual tree. It's a symbolic truth we've all agreed upon. But it goes so much deeper than words. Think about ceremonial clothing, or the specific incense used in a religious ritual, or, most powerfully, music.
Music as symbolic truth.
Pure symbolic truth. A composer can take a dim, confused reality like the chaos of grief or the pride of a martial victory and translate it into an arrangement of sounds. The beating of drums gives emotional clothing to martial sentiments. A solemn choir gives clear appearance to religious awe. The music perfectly matches the subjective feeling of the listener.
That makes so much sense. It acts as a bridge. And the book explains that this is exactly how our earliest social habits formed. In the infancy of human history, primitive behavior patterns and intellectual myths mutually interpreted each other.
They feed off one another.
Yeah, think of an ancient tribal dance and a mythological story. The physical behavior of the dance evokes the feeling of the myth, and conversely, believing the myth creates this irresistible urge to perform the dance. They validate each other.
They do. Yet, for all the beauty of those subtle cultural symbols as biological creatures, we still fundamentally crave what Whitehead calls blunt truth.
Blunt truth.
Blunt truth is much simpler. It is just the direct, conformal correspondence between clear appearance and reality. No symbols, no time lags, just a direct, unfiltered match between what is actually out there and what you are experiencing. In human experience, this is primarily our raw sense perception.
And that blunt truth is deeply qualitative, isn't it? It's the visceral experience of enjoying green foliage greenly, or looking at a sunset and feeling an emotional pattern that perfectly matches those fiery colors. That really struck me, especially when the book contrasts that sensory reality with extreme mathematical abstractions.
That is a crucial distinction to make. Mathematical abstractions lack that qualitative, blunt truth of feeling.
Right. You can't have a squareness of emotion. Mere triplicity, the concept of the number 3, dictates no specific feeling in your soul. But you can certainly feel the qualitative spikiness of a square object or the smoothness of a sphere. The color green dictates a feeling. Abstract math does not.
Which naturally leads us to ask, if our senses are gathering all these blunt truths and qualitative feelings, what happens when we arrange them perfectly? And that brings us to Whitehead's concept of beauty. In this framework, beauty isn't just a painting or pretty face. Beauty is defined primarily as the mutual adaptation of the various factors in an experience to produce maximum effectiveness.
Maximum effectiveness.
He goes so far as to call it the ultimate aim of the universe.
The ultimate aim. That's a massive claim. But I was trying to unpack how he categorizes it. He splits beauty into 2 forms, right? A minor form and a major form. Walk me through the difference there.
It's actually a very intuitive split. Think about the minor form of beauty as simply the absence of clash. It is the absence of mutual inhibition or vulgarity among all the different things you're experiencing at once. Nothing is fighting for your attention in a painful way. It's pleasant. It is peaceful.
Like a nice quiet afternoon.
Exactly. But the major form of beauty, that requires the minor form as a baseline. And then it adds something breathtaking. It introduces entirely new contrasts. It takes different, perhaps unexpected elements and weaves them together to raise the intensity of your feelings. It achieves a true, vibrant perfection of harmony.
To really understand how that major harmony happens, the book details three metaphysical doctrines governing beauty. I want to make sure I'm translating this correctly because they get quite dense.
They do, yeah.
The first doctrine basically says that every single qualitative factor in the universe dictates how you feel it, right? Except for pure math, or if you're looking at something as just a blank, meaningless object, a it. Otherwise, the actual qualities of the thing you perceive force their way into your subjective form.
Exactly. The object gives you the raw material of your emotion. And the second doctrine is about unity. It simply means that all those different feelings you're getting from the outside world, the sights, the sounds, the temperatures, they don't stay separate. Your mind integrates them into one single unified fact of feeling in that exact moment of formation. You don't experience a room as a disjointed list of items. You experience the singular vibe of the room.
It's the third doctrine that I found almost poetic. It's about spontaneity, the idea that while the past conditions us, it does not completely determine us. We have the absolute autonomy to synthesize our own reality in the occasion. We supply our own missing pieces. We aren't just robots processing data.
That spontaneity is vital because it dictates how we deal with things that don't fit perfectly into our reality. It dictates how we handle inhibition or clash in our experience. The book draws a very sharp line between two types of clash. The first is anesthesia. Now, anesthesia isn't necessarily a bad thing here. It is simply the painless exclusion of conflicting feelings.
Like tuning things out.
Right? Think of it like turning down the background noise so you can focus on conversation. It limits your experience, making it finite, but it doesn't ruin the perfection of the moment. The second type, however, is aesthetic destruction or discord. This is the positive, active feeling of evil, sorrow, horror, and pain. It is the feeling of mutual destructiveness where things actively, violently clash and ruin the harmony.
Wait, so if beauty is all about harmony and mutual adaptation, where does discord fit in? Is a clash always an aesthetic destruction? Because later in the text, it seems to suggest that discord has a paradoxical value, that it's somehow necessary.
It is absolutely necessary, and that is one of the most brilliant paradoxes in the book. You might logically think discord is purely bad, but without discord, progress is impossible.
Why is that?
Because lower perfections eventually become tame and stale.
Hmm.
If you just have a mere qualitative harmony, that minor beauty where nothing clashes, it eventually becomes debased and boring and lacks outline and zest. True progress in human civilization is founded upon the experience of discordant feelings, forcing us to find a new, higher harmony.
That makes total sense when you look at history. The book's example of ancient Greek civilization perfectly illustrates this. The Greeks achieved an immense ideal of perfection. Their art, their philosophy, their modes of life all conspired to express this wonderful, harmonious ideal. But they attained it. They reached the ceiling of that specific perfection.
And then they stopped.
Right. And because they didn't have any fresh discord or fresh adventure, their inspiration withered. It descended into the lifeless, stale repetition of the Hellenistic epoch. Genius was completely stifled by conventionality.
It's a tragic pattern. You see the exact same thing in the stagnation of the Byzantine and Chinese empires. Despite their unbelievable greatness and stability, they suffered 1,000 years of mere repetition. The lesson is that even absolute perfection cannot bear the tedium of indefinite repetition.
You have to have spontaneity. You have to actively search for new perfections to keep civilization alive and maintain zest. The text mentions that when a society hits a stage of perfection, it usually starts by exploring minor variations, like looking at the beautiful, varied details in medieval Gothic architecture. They weren't reinventing the building, just playing with the details. That is a minor adventure.
A safe exploration.
Yeah. But eventually, a bolder adventure is required to save us from staleness. The introduction of Christianity was given as a massive, major adventure that provided entirely new societal ideals, completely reshaping the harmony of civilization.
And that search for new adventure brings us face to face with the profound intermingling of beauty and evil. Because our reality is finite, meaning choosing one path always excludes another. We are constantly confronted by basic disharmony in the actual world. Whitehead outlines 4 ways we deal with this disharmony. First, as we mentioned, anesthesia, just ignoring the clash entirely. Second, we could just sit there and feel the acute, painful disruption of the discord. Third, we can reduce the conflicting intensities to a low-intensity background, allowing a clear foreground to emerge. That is basically our habitual state of human experience. We just push the chaos to the back of our minds.
But it's the fourth way that is the most fascinating, because it's the most artistic. It's the use of appearance to simplify and save massive qualitative variety from just being tamely eliminated. We create an appearance that takes the chaotic intensities of reality and organizes them into a simplified form, saving the massive qualitative variety without destroying our minds.
And that simplification only works when we truly understand the emotional power of individuality, what the book calls the prehension of the it.
Yes, the it. This was one of my favorite analogies in the whole text. Imagine a dog smelling its master. The dog isn't walking into the room and admiring a generally pleasant scent. The dog isn't a perfume critic. It is desperately, pointedly searching for the specific it that claims its entire affection. The room could be full of technically sweeter, more harmonious smells, but the dog ignores them completely. It wants that original individual it.
That animal instinct applies profoundly to human pursuits as well. Think about the field of archaeology. Imagine you are standing in a museum looking at a cracked, inscribed stone that was carved under the very eyes of the ancient Assyrian king Sennacherib. Now, a modern 3D printer could make a replica that looks completely identical, every scratch, every curve. But the replica lacks the immense emotional weight. Why? Because the original side appeal. It commands a poignancy of feeling, generalized emotional aromas, feelings of awe, love, hate, the worth of history, replace the mere sensory visual of the rock. The individual object becomes entwined with our deepest generalized emotions. Think about a handwritten letter from your grandmother versus a photocopy. The individual,
It matters.
that enduring individuality is the absolute backbone of strong aesthetic experience. The book uses the statues on the porch of the cathedral at Chartres as an example. When you look at them, each statue retains its absolute individual beauty. It demands your attention as a singularity. Yet, simultaneously, they all lend themselves perfectly to the relative harmony of the whole cathedral structure, individuality and harmony working together. Which naturally brings us to the ultimate comparison, the intricate relationship between truth and beauty. If we place them side by side, Whitehead argues that beauty is wider and inherently self-justifying. The whole direction of the universe leans toward beauty. Truth, on the other hand, is much narrower. Truth merely concerns whether our appearance matches reality. And importantly, truth is not necessarily beautiful. It is not even necessarily neutral. Truth can be horrific, evil, or deeply painful.
So if truth can be painful and ugly, why is it still overwhelmingly important for achieving beauty?
Because truth acts as a blunt force of cleanliness. It removes the dirt of unwanted irrelevance. When what you perceive has a direct, truthful relationship to what is actually real, there's a profound security about the beauty you attain. It isn't a fragile illusion that will shatter tomorrow. Truth provides a secure pledge for the future.
Let me make sure I'm following. Because truth secures beauty, that must define the whole purpose of art, right? The book says art is the purposeful adaptation of appearance to reality to achieve truthful beauty. But it makes a very strong, almost controversial point here. Goodness is not the aim of art.
That is a vital distinction to make. Goodness concerns the deep interrelations of the real world, usually focused on preventing a relapse into chaos. Goodness is about safety. Art, however, concerns the perfections attainable by purposeful adaptation right now.
I have to bring up the evolutionary analogy the book uses here because it is wonderfully playful and really drives this home. Imagine respectable ancient amoebae countless ages ago dwelling safely in the ocean. Imagine them stubbornly refusing to evolve, refusing to migrate from the ocean to dry land because they were fiercely defending their morals.
This is a great image.
It points out that the defense of morals is often just the battle cry that rallies stupidity against change. It made me smile because you see that exact same stubbornness in human nature today.
It's humorous, but it highlights the completely contrasting timelines of art and morals. Art neglects the safety of the future. Art is willing to take a massive risk to secure an immediate, finite harvest of perfection right here and now in the present moment. Its entire business is to render the present moment a success. Morals, however, consist of aiming at the ideal future and preventing a relapse into lower levels. Morals want safety tomorrow. Art wants perfection today.
So what is the mechanism that makes human art possible? It's consciousness. The book describes consciousness as the quality that emerges from the contrast between what actuality is and what ideality could be. It serves as a selective spotlight. It provides an extreme selective emphasis, shining a bright light on only a tiny portion of experience while leaving the massive dim elements of reality safely in the background.
And if we dig all the way down to the biological and psychological origins of art, we find it stems from our sheer craving for reenaction. There's a biological law that an embryo reproduces physical features of its ancestors from remote geologic epochs. Well, in human experience, art arises from our psychological need to dramatically relive the intense emotional lives of ourselves and our ancestors.
The example of Odysseus perfectly captures this. Think of the haunting image of Odysseus standing among the shades in the underworld, listening to the blind poet Homer chant the Odyssey. Art allows Odysseus to freely relive the intense, terrifying emotions of his past necessities, but without facing the actual danger in the present. The physical strain is over, but the joy of the intense feeling remains. Odysseus can enjoy his past perils while evading the Furies. Art, seen in this light, is a curative, psychopathic reaction of the human race to the intense stresses of its own existence. It's therapy through illusion.
That profound realization leads us to reconsider exactly what we are doing when we build societies. It brings us to the baffling definition of civilization itself. We intuitively know what it means for a person or a society to be civilized, but pinning down a definition completely escapes us. Consider how modern Europe has habitually looked backward, taking the Greeks and Romans at their absolute best period as the ultimate standard for society, constantly trying to reproduce the excellencies of Athens in its prime.
As you move through your own life, consider how your daily pursuit of immediate beauty might just be a necessary artistic rebellion against the stagnant customs of routine. If art truly is a psychopathic reaction to the stress of existence, how much of our modern entertainment is actually a desperate biological attempt to heal ourselves through the illusion of beauty? This backward-looking emulation of the Greeks and Romans brings us to a critical threshold, leading us immediately to uncover the true nature of adventure in the continuous journey of this book. And it is exactly this continuous unraveling of thought, this persistent forward motion, that brings us to the ultimate culmination of Alfred North Whitehead's book, Adventures of Ideas.
Exactly.
If you trace the entire arc of our exploration so far, bringing us into this 10th and final segment of the text, we are finally stepping onto the very summit of his philosophy.
We really are.
We're looking directly at the two crowning qualities of a civilized society, which he defines as adventure and peace.
Right, and the mission for us here right now is to sit with every single nuance of these concepts.
Yeah.
We're going to take our time, completely unhurried, to really understand how a society avoids decay and achieves a profound, lasting harmony.
Because it requires us to look at the universe not as a collection of static objects, but as an endless, unrelenting flow.
That flow is the fundamental reality. It's the only place we can truly begin. The absolute foundation of any real understanding of human life or sociological theory itself is the recognition that a static maintenance of perfection is simply impossible.
It just doesn't exist.
No, it's an axiom rooted in the very nature of things. The universe really only offers two choices to mankind, and indeed to any society: advance or decadence.
Advance or decadence.
Right, and Whitehead makes this rather startling assertion that the pure conservative, the one who wishes to freeze a moment of societal perfection and hold it indefinitely, is actually fighting against the essence of the universe itself.
Wait, let me make sure I'm fully grasping this. So, if a society reaches a golden age, a period of immense prosperity and artistic achievement, and they decide, this is it, let's just keep everything exactly like this forever, Whitehead is saying they're inherently destroying themselves.
Precisely. Because the very essence of actuality, of what is completely real, is process.
Process.
Yes. You can only understand a thing in terms of its becoming and its perishing. There is no magical halt where a thing is just perfectly, statically itself. The conservative instinct to preserve a golden age denies the first metaphysical principle, which is that actuality is process.
Which completely rejects that early idea of Plato's, right? The concept of a superworld of ideas that is just forever perfect and unchanging.
It completely dismantles it. And it equally rejects the metaphor given to us by Aristotle and centuries later by John Locke, who famously pictured the human mind as an empty cabinet.
Empty cabinet.
Yeah, they viewed the mind as a static box, passively waiting to receive the impress of ideas from the outside world.
I have always struggled with that metaphor. The empty cabinet just feels so lifeless. Can you break down why Whitehead finds that Aristotelian logic so deeply flawed when it comes to our human experience?
Gladly. The empty cabinet implies that reality resides in the static recipient of the experience, the wooden box itself, so to speak, rather than in the process of experiencing.
Right.
Whitehead denies this entirely. The mind is not a static box. The process of becoming and perishing is the reality. Think about the past. In the cabinet metaphor, the past is just old files shoved in a drawer. But in Whitehead's universe, the past is not a discarded thing. It perishes only to energize the present. It becomes the complex origin, the very base of a completely new actuality.
It makes you think of a fire.
A fire.
Yeah, the wood doesn't just sit there in a cabinet. It is consumed, it perishes. But in doing so, it provides the energy, the heat, and the light of the fire in this exact fleeting moment.
That is a beautiful way to visualize it.
Yeah.
The perishing of the past fuels the creation of the novel occasion. And that transitions us perfectly to the second metaphysical principle Whitehead introduces, which is the doctrine that every single occasion of actuality is, in its own nature, finite.
Finitude, meaning there are limits.
Exactly. Whenever you realize one experience, whenever you choose one path, you're necessarily excluding an unbounded infinite sea of other possibilities. You simply cannot have all perfections at once.
This feels incredibly relevant to the way we live today. I mean, think about your own life. How often we are paralyzed by choice, whether it's choosing a career, moving to a new city, or even committing to a relationship. We want to keep all our options open.
We do.
But Whitehead is saying that choosing one beautiful harmony inherently means shutting the door on another.
Yes, this is the principle of intrinsic incompatibility. Combining all perfections wouldn't result in a super-perfection. It would produce chaos or even evil. They are mutually exclusive by nature.
Wow.
Whitehead even points out that the divine nature itself must operate within this reality. We have to conceive of the divine as entertaining all ideals conceptually, but urging their physical realization each in its due season rather than all at once. Finitude is not a result of human evil or some earthly imperfection. It is simply the architecture of reality.
So, applying these to a whole civilization. If a society reaches a culmination, it achieves a large measure of a certain type of perfection. It can maintain that height for a while by experimenting within that specific type, tweaking the margins. But eventually, those minor variations are exhausted. What happens then?
When a society runs out of fresh variations, an incredibly dangerous staleness sets in.
Staleness.
Yes, the vivid appreciation of life gradually lowers. Convention begins to dominate everything. A learned orthodoxy steps in and actively suppresses any new adventure. The culture becomes trapped in its own past successes.
And here is where I found one of the most fascinating historical observations in the entire book. Whitehead points out that when a civilization is in this slow creeping decline, the very last flicker of originality it manages to produce is satire.
Satire, yes.
Why satire? Why is that the final stage?
Because satire survives and flourishes upon the outworn, decaying features of a social system. When the internal creative springs of originality are dry, the only intellectual energy left is to critique the staleness.
That makes so much sense.
When the freshness of a civilization is completely gone, bitterness remains. Satire is the brilliant, cynical laughter of a society facing the oncoming road of boredom.
He gives such precise examples of this, too. In the Silver Age of Roman culture, right as the empire was losing its vital breath and becoming an administrative machine, the satirist Lucian emerges.
Right.
Centuries later, as the Renaissance culture nears the massive, violent disruptions of the Industrial and French revolutions, you see Voltaire and Edward Gibbon perfecting their own brilliant, biting satire.
He even brings it closer to our modern era, pointing to the close of the Victorian epoch right after the Great War, highlighting writers like Lytton Strachey in England and Sinclair Lewis in America. You can have a slow decadence where the outward show of civilization remains. The buildings stand, the laws are passed, but the actual values of life are slowly ebbing away into cynical observation.
But there is an alternative to that agonizingly slow decline into sarcasm and staleness, isn't there?
There is. A society might exhaust a certain form of civilization without actually exhausting its own internal creative courage. When that happens, you get a quick, sometimes chaotic transition to a completely new civilization.
Chaotic, but necessary.
Yes, it can involve widespread dislocation and deep unhappiness, but it is a leap forward rather than a slow rot. However, these quick transitions are only possible when thought has run far ahead of physical realization.
The imagination has to venture out into the unknown first. Think of Christopher Columbus. This isn't just about him getting on a boat. Long before he ever set sail across the trackless ocean, he was dreaming of the Far East and of a round world.
Exactly.
The physical adventure was entirely predicated on an adventure of thought. He had to reject the safe, accepted reality of his time in his mind before he could ever challenge it in the physical world.
And as Whitehead notes, adventure rarely reaches its predetermined end. Columbus never found China, but he discovered a new world. A society only preserves its vigor so long as it harbors a real, lived contrast between what has been and what could be. It has to have the nerve to adventure far beyond the safeties of the past. Without that adventure, civilization is in full decay.
If we define culture merely as knowing the best that has been said and done in the past, we are making a dangerous omission. We forget that in their day, those great achievements were radical, terrifying adventures. I mean, Aeschylus and Euripides were not writing safe classical texts to be studied in quiet libraries. They were tearing up the old ways of understanding the world.
Exactly. A purely passive knowledge of the past loses the whole value of its message. To really understand the harmony of a great experience, we have to look at the third metaphysical principle, individuality.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully. Because Whitehead contrasts individuality with something he calls the sensationalist doctrine. That phrase, sensationalist doctrine, sounds like something from a modern tabloid. What is he actually criticizing here?
It's a bit of philosophical jargon, but it's crucial. In modern times, there's been a tendency to reduce our experience of the world to a tame, vague, superficial pattern of the senses. That is the sensationalist doctrine.
Just a superficial pattern.
Right. It assumes that a harmonious experience is just a pleasant arrangement of shapes, colors, or sounds, relatively barren of high significance. Whitehead insists that sense perception, despite its prominence in our daily consciousness, is actually quite superficial.
So true. Deep harmony is not just a pleasant arrangement of sensory inputs.
Right. True harmony requires the enduring individuality of real, stubborn facts from the past. The individual facts of the past lie at the absolute base of our immediate experience. They are the reality from which our current emotion springs.
Let's ground this in a physical space, the way the book does with the image of a Gothic cathedral, specifically Chartres.
Oh, perfect example.
When you walk into that massive, quiet space, the sculpture and the stone tracery don't just blend into a blurry, pleasing background.
Oh,
They claim your attention in their own right because of their supreme individuality. You look at a single carved saint or a gargoyle, and it is a masterpiece of cold stone and shadow radiating its own unique existence.
yet, almost miraculously, those intensely individual sculptures also subserve the harmony of the entire cathedral. They deliberately lead your eye upward to the massive vaulting and horizontally down the nave to the altar.
They guide you.
Yes, they command your attention, but then they immediately surrender that attention for the sake of the whole composition. They could not perform this monumental service if they were bland, vague, or lacked supreme individuality.
This completely reframes how we view discord, doesn't it? Whether in music, in art, or in society. A clash or a discord doesn't destroy the harmony, it actually enhances it.
It does. Discord rescues the entire composition from being tame and vapid. It substantiates the forceful individuality of the parts. It forces you to feel their absolute claim to existence. When a great civilization is infused with this kind of art, it clothes the world in what Whitehead calls the appearance of immortality.
The appearance of immortality, that naturally brings us to the most elusive and perhaps the most important quality of civilization that Whitehead explores, which is peace. And I want to pause here because we must be incredibly precise. When we hear the word peace, we immediately think of a lack of conflict. We think of sitting on a quiet beach or a political treaty between warring nations. But that's not what he means at all, is it?
Not at all. Whitehead's peace is not a negative state. It is not an absence of noise or conflict. Most importantly, it is not the bastard substitute of anesthesia.
Anesthesia.
Yes, deliberately numbing yourself to the world's pain, ignoring the complexity of life, burying yourself in mindless distractions. That is the destruction of life and motion, not the crowning of it.
Peace, in this deep philosophical sense, is defined as the harmony of harmonies. It is a profoundly positive feeling. It is a metaphysical insight that actually surpasses your own personality.
Surpasses the self entirely.
Right. When you experience this kind of peace, that frantic, stressful preoccupation with your own self, your acquisitive desires, your need to constantly consume and achieve, it just subsides. You feel a fundamental trust in the self-justification of beauty.
It enlarges your field of attention to coordinations far wider than your own personal existence. And this connects to what might be the most heartbreaking and beautiful theme in the book, the relationship between peace and tragedy.
Because true peace does not ignore the tragic issues of the universe. It doesn't look away from suffering.
No, it embraces it. Peace is the understanding of tragedy, and at the same time, its preservation. As we established earlier with the idea of process, decay, transition, loss, and displacement belong to the very essence of the creative advance.
You can't have becoming without perishing.
Exactly. You cannot have a universe of constant becoming without the constant perishing of the old.
When you reach a state of high consciousness, the enjoyment of existence is completely entwined with pain, frustration, and loss. But peace keeps our sensitiveness to that tragedy incredibly vivid. It sees the tragedy as a living agent.
A living agent.
Yes, every tragedy discloses an ideal of what might have been and was not. It shows us the ghost of another path. Peace is the intuition of permanence amid the passing of so much beauty and daring.
To fully grasp the weight of this piece, we could look at its antithesis, which Whitehead defines as youth. The deepest definition of youth is life as yet untouched by tragedy.
Think back to that time in your own life. Being a teenager, youth is incredibly vivid, but not necessarily happy. It is distinguished by a wholehearted, almost absolute absorption in personal enjoyments and personal discomforts.
Quick laughter, quick tears, quick despair, because the short-sightedness of youth matches its lack of experience.
Right.
When you are young, a single failure, a bad grade, a broken relationship feels like the literal end of the world because there is no memory of past disasters survived. Generosity and cruelty are equally natural to youth because they simply cannot anticipate the full ripple effects of their actions.
But youth has a profound capacity to transcend itself, specifically through its susceptibility to the beauty of conduct. A young person can become captivated by motives that require the complete irrelevance of their own ego. The most universal example of this is falling in love. The test of our better nature is when youthful love passes from mere selfishness, the desire to be loved, to absolute devotion to the other.
When a young person truly grasps where beauty dwells, their self-surrender is absolute. The narrow, self-regarding motives break down. That moment, even if it traverses consciousness only in a flash, yields a brief, blinding glimpse of peace. It is the harmony of the soul's activities aligning with ideal aims that lie far beyond any personal gratification.
Yet that desire to matter in the universe, to transcend the self, can also become deeply distorted, especially in vigorous, highly active societies. We see this in the egotistic desire for fame. Whitehead quotes Milton here, calling fame that last infirmity of noble mind.
Fame is essentially an inversion of the social impulse. You want to stand conspicuous in the scheme of things. You crave sympathy and admiration from an audience, but it remains entirely self-centered.
And the pathology of this feeling is terrifying. We see it throughout history. A conqueror or a tyrant whose craving for admiration becomes so twisted that they end up destroying the very audience they seek that fame from.
Exactly.
They ravage the world to force it to look at them. It's a desire for the harmony of the world to be centered entirely on their own ego.
We also see a lesser, though much more common, limitation in personal love. Take, for instance, a mother's intense love for her child. It involves a passionate self-devotion, yes, but it often remains a clinging to conditions for selfish happiness.
A limitation to a particular reality?
Right. It produces a nerve-wracking, distracting devotion, though it still yields a vital sense of aim in the universe.
This expansion of aim beyond the self brings us to the dogma of moral codes and religious beliefs. These codes explicitly express that the perfection of life resides in aims far beyond the individual. Whitehead points to the historical example of the Roman farmer and statesman Regulus.
Regulus is a fascinating case study. He was captured by the Carthaginians and sent back to Rome to negotiate peace, under the oath that if he failed, he would return to captivity.
Yeah.
Instead of arguing for peace to save his own life, he advised the Roman Senate to keep fighting.
He advised them to fight.
Yes, and then he voluntarily returned to Carthage, facing absolute certainty of torture and death.
And he didn't do this for the promise of a mystic heaven or a reward in the afterlife. His ideal aim was the flourishing of the Roman Republic in this world. This aim transcended his individual personality. He achieved ultimate magnificence by sacrificing his own personal existence for an ideal. Conduct like that evokes an instinctive pulse of emotion across generations.
However, Whitehead offers a vital critique here regarding what he calls the dogmatic fallacy of moral codes. For centuries, codes have been handed down by a god on a mountaintop, a saint in a cave, or a divine despot on a throne. And they are presented as absolute, static, and incapable of improvement.
But in reality, these codes are heavily relative to their immediate environments. A code developed by people living on the fertile fringe of a desert will differ vastly from one developed on the steep frozen slopes of the Himalayas or a rich, flooding river delta.
Precisely.
The meaning of critical terms like ownership, family, or even murder shifts based on survival needs. Conduct that produces harmony in one environment might be destructively degrading in another.
The idea that there is one precise, static set of rules for every being on Earth in every era must be put aside. Yet, despite their relativity, what these codes do witness to is the eternal aim at social perfection.
And when we use the word society in this exploration, we have to expand our minds far beyond just human gatherings in a city square. In Whitehead's Metaphysics, the human soul itself is a society of occasions. The animal body is a society ministering to the soul. Nations are societies. They all claim our loyalties and our loves, pulling us out of the sheer actuality of the present moment.
And within all these interwoven societies, the attainment of truth belongs to the essence of peace. But we are not just talking about the truth or falsehood of a simple math equation. The essential truth that peace demands is the confirmation of appearance to reality.
Can we break that down? Appearance versus reality.
Since perception, by its very nature, rearranges and distorts the stubborn facts of the world, it provides an appearance of reality, filtered through our limited biology. If that appearance is built by importing false qualities, qualities that have no counterpart in the inescapable stubborn reality of the universe, then the occasion of experience contains a falsehood.
A dislocation.
Right. A feeling of dislocation between appearance and reality is a destructive force. It robs life of its zest for adventure. Truth means that our perception of the world hasn't built itself up by including elements entirely foreign to the reality from which it springs.
All of this, the rejection of stasis, the necessity of adventure, the vivid individuality of experience, the embrace of tragedy, it all culminates in what Whitehead calls the supreme adventure. But to truly grasp this, I need an explanation of something you mentioned earlier. Plato's receptacle. What is a receptacle in this context, and why is Whitehead reacting against it?
Plato envisioned a receptacle that was essentially a void space. It was abstract from all individual occasions, a container for reality, but entirely bare of all forms itself, a passive emptiness waiting to be filled. The supreme adventure is the exact opposite of this void.
The unity of adventure includes the living, pulsing urge toward all possibilities. It doesn't just sit empty. It actively embraces every single individual reality, each with its own personal and social importance. It doesn't erase the sharp, discordant details for the sake of a bland whole. It transmutes the real occasions of the advancing world into a magnificent unity of appearance.
And this appearance, deeply enjoyed and fully realized, is the final beauty with which the universe achieves its justification. It is the realization that the universe is not an empty stage, but a relentless creative advance.
The creative advance.
Yes, and at the very heart of the nature of things, embedded in the architecture of reality itself, there is always the dream of youth and the harvest of tragedy. The adventure of the universe starts with that bold, unblemished dream, and inevitably, necessarily, it reaps tragic beauty.
That brings us to the immediate, quiet experience of this final fact. The realization that all the suffering, all the perishing, all the dislocation of the temporal world ultimately attains its end in a magnificent harmony of harmonies. Which leaves us with this quiet, lingering reflection on Whitehead's ultimate secret of civilization, that if you listen closely to the rhythm of our existence, there is always this unending interplay between the bright, naive dream of youth and the inevitable, sobering harvest of tragedy, intertwining over and over to create the very fabric of peace.